They called him Dapiek Absaroka, the killer of crows. In 1847, a young trapper named John Johnston found his pregnant wife murdered, and in his grief, he forged a weapon out of pure vengeance. For 20 years, he waged a private war against an entire nation, leaving a trail of scalps and a terrifying reputation for consuming the livers of his fallen foes. But was he truly a monster, or a man shaped by the brutal reality of the frontier? This is the dark, legendary saga of liver-eating Johnson. The campfire is ready, so stay with me. The story is about to start. The Young Trapper, the making of a legend. In May of 1847, a tragedy struck that would carve a dark path for John Johnston. Crow warriors murdered his pregnant wife and took her scalp. For years following that day, Johnston hunted crows, killing and scalping them in turn. But he did more than just kill. He consumed their livers raw. He did not eat them out of starvation, but out of a grim principle, a principle that the history of his life might help explain. While other tribes, such as the Blackfeet, might provoke his rage or mistreat him, only the Crow Nation suffered this specific, dreadful humiliation at Johnston's hands. To them, and to the frontier, he became Dapiek Absaroka, the killer of crows. This title became a weapon in itself. Even when Indian war parties held the tactical advantage of an ambush, they often broke rank and fled if Johnston killed just one of their number. As the designated Crow killer, he knew that if captured by other tribes, he might be kept alive to be sold at a high price to his specific enemies, giving him a chance to escape. On other occasions, his fearsome reputation allowed him to turn tribal rivalries to his advantage, harvesting a profitable collection of scalps in the ensuing chaos. While his initial lust for vengeance was undoubtedly real, born of love for his wife or wounded pride, the terrifying reputation it spawned became a valuable business asset in the wilderness. Before he was the liver eater, he was simply John Johnston, a young trapper noted for his brute strength and rapid mastery of survival skills. However, his physical power and cunning were merely footnotes to his emerging legend as liver-eating Johnson, a man viewed by the Indians as possessed or divinely mad. Johnston, often called Johnson, was a man of few words, a trait that only deepened his menacing aura. He was perceived as sullen and mistrustful, yet he was willing to speak when necessary to correct the record or inform his peers of things they missed. His first companion was Old John Hatcher, a legendary and talkative trapper who took delight in spreading tales about his protege. Hatcher's early stories painted Johnston as a greenhorn who had been swindled by the wily trader Joe Robidoux, and who allowed Hatcher to sneak up on his campfire. Yet, even in these tales, the greenhorn evolved, eventually outsmarting Robidoux in a horse trade and spotting a feigning Indian warrior before the veteran Hatcher did. Later, Johnson chose a long-term partner who was even more instrumental in building the myth, Del Guay. Del, who claimed he knew when not to ask questions, managed to gather the details necessary to fuel the legend. It was Del who accompanied Johnson on his visits to the cabin of the tragic crazy woman, the widow of John Morgan. It was Del who witnessed the death of the last of the 20 Crow warriors specially dedicated to killing Johnson. Del did not shy away from describing his own nausea when Johnson cut out and ate the livers. He survived to recount these stories long after Johnson died of old age, sharing them in the mid-1880s and again in 1900 with J.F. Anderson, known as White Eye. The ingredients for a legend were certainly present. Johnston's sharp wit and immense physical power were natural traits for a figure like liver-eating Johnson. The crazy woman's nightly mourning for her dead served as a haunting chorus to his life. His enemies, the Crows, were a tribe respected for their dignity and wisdom. Their decision to mark 20 specific heroes to hunt down one Dapiek added a sense of high drama to the feud. Johnston's peers, the mountain men, who joined his fights when possible, highlighted his bloody history with their own eccentric behaviors. Against the backdrop of the frontier, where private grudges were common, Johnston's vendetta stood out. In a life filled with endless toil and danger, if a trapper chose to risk the tomahawk or the stake for revenge, no one would deny him that right. Johnston was not the first to walk a path of vengeance. Louis Wetzel and Blackjack of the Juniata had done so before him, but his was perhaps the most spectacular. If he were merely a killer of Indians, a blood-soaked cannibal, the Crow killer would be easily dismissed as insane or subhuman. But he cannot be so simply categorized. He was not merely cruel. In fact, he often seemed to step back from the barbarity displayed by his peers, as if their lack of order offended him. Conversely, they were often more disturbed by his consumption of livers than by the act of killing itself. And while Johnston shared the general frontier contempt for Indians, his life story repeatedly reveals a genuine respect for the warriors of various tribes. Although he was the scourge of the Crows during his prime, a day eventually came when, moved by sheer admiration for Crow bravery and magnanimity, he ended his terrible feud and rode with them as a brother-in-arms. The Hair Merchants. In the fading light of an autumn afternoon in 1843, the steamboat Thames, having traveled upriver from St. Louis, navigated the currents to dock at the well-known landing in St. Joseph. A haze, typical of Indian summer, drifted from the distant Rockies across the plains to the Missouri River, wrapping the trading post and the colorful Black Snake Hills in a blue mist. As the gangplank lowered and passengers disembarked, they found themselves being watched by the town's idlers, by sharp-eyed Indian braves scouting for opportunity, and by local riffraff looking for a job or a drink. One young traveler started up the dusty thoroughfare, slinging his belongings in a skin sack over one shoulder. A large, hulking river tramp lunged out of the dirt, attempting to snatch the bag, but was promptly knocked flat for his trouble. Roaring with anger, the tramp scrambled to his feet, fists raised. The young traveler dropped his sack to the road, turned, and stared the man down. "Something wrong?" he asked. The loafer sized up his opponent in a heartbeat. Whatever he saw in the young man's demeanor unnerved him. Wiping blood and grime from his face, the tramp backed down and turned away. The young man continued his walk up the street. If he had spoken to anyone on the boat, the young man likely heard tales of the town's founder, the old trader Joe Robidoux. Joe was a withered, stooped frontiersman with squinting eyes and a reputation for swindling everyone, from shrewd competitors like Manuel Lisa to his own flesh and blood. Years prior, when Lisa attempted to rival him in trade with the Pawnees, Robidoux had invited him for a drink, locked him in his infamous whiskey cellar, and went off to secure the Pawnee trade himself. He treated his son, Joe Jr., no better. When the younger Robidoux inherited valuable St. Louis real estate, his father locked him in that same cellar, dry of liquor this time, until the thirst-crazed son traded the land deed for a single glass of whiskey. Old Joe stood behind the counter of his supply store when the stranger entered, dropped his gear on the dirt floor, and handed over a scrap of brown paper. The old trader's expression remained blank as he read the scrawled note. He showed no emotion as he looked up to study the messenger. He saw a powerful frame, 6 feet tall and 190 pounds, belonging to a young man of about 20 who had not yet reached his full bulk. Massive shoulders supported extraordinarily long arms. His hair was a bright auburn, cut at half length, and a red stubble covered his full, strong face. His eyes shifted from a cold, pale blue to a speckled, dirty gray. Perhaps they held a lingering trace of the violence from the street. Old Joe might have recognized the merciless depth that others would later talk about. "Old Hawkins sent you?" Robidoux asked. "He said he had 3 rifles to sell." Robidoux didn't answer, so the newcomer looked around at the merchandise. "And I'll need traps and a place to sleep." "Says here your name is John Johnston," the trader noted. The young man nodded. "You can stay here tonight. We'll settle up in the morning." Johnston slept on corn husk-filled grain sacks on the store's hard floor, locked inside to prevent him from stealing from the king of thieves. It seemed he had barely closed his eyes before the old man was shaking him awake. After a breakfast of venison, corn pone, and bitter black coffee, the trading commenced. A brand new .30 caliber Hawken rifle cost Johnston $50. It was double the St. Louis price, but fair. It was a top-tier weapon, the difference between life and death. However, Johnston would later discover he had paid 5 times the actual value for his traps, as Robidoux didn't have to answer to Hawken for those. A Comanche pony, brought into the yard by a Pawnee, was promised to be faster than anything north of Texas, another $50. Surprisingly, Robidoux threw in an Oto tomahawk as a gift. Having spent his cash, but equipped with a Bowie knife from St. Louis, Johnston asked for directions to good trapping grounds. Robidoux bit off a piece of tobacco, chewed solemnly, and spoke to the Pawnee. After a moment, he spat and pointed west. "Trapping is good out on the Big Blue," he lied. "This Indian will put you on the trail." By mid-morning, Johnston was riding the Comanche pony with his gear packed behind a treeless Cheyenne saddle. Old Joe watched him go, chuckling as he pocketed the profit from his practical joke. Old John Hatcher was in the Big Blue territory by chance. He had left Independence with a massive caravan bound for Santa Fe, not to trade or guard the 175 wagons, but merely to visit old friends. At Council Grove, he broke away and headed north toward the Platte. Approaching the Big Blue, he sensed activity near the riverbank. A kingfisher, usually a wary bird, was perched low in a cottonwood, too focused on the scene below to notice the rider. Hatcher, a veteran of countless dangerous encounters, stopped his horse, dismounted, and crept forward to surprise both the bird and whatever held its attention. For young Johnston, bent over a trap set beneath the bank, Hatcher's voice boomed like thunder. "Curse me for a Kiowa, but your back makes a fine target for a red arrow." Johnston froze. The sentinel kingfisher screeched and fled the tree. A man might be inexperienced, yet still possess instinct. Johnston knew better than to reach for his rifle. Instead, he turned slowly. Standing on the prairie ledge above him was a man holding a Hawken rifle loosely, hammer cocked, muzzle pointed directly at Johnston. Silhouetted against the sky, Johnston saw the quintessential mountain man. Hatcher was over 6 feet tall and 200 pounds, with long blonde hair and a heavy beard. He wore Blackfoot tanned buckskins adorned with crow beadwork, Cheyenne moccasins, and a Shoshone beaver cap. A belt of buffalo hide held a hatchet, knife, powder horn, and a metal ring for scalps. As Johnston took this in, the mountain man lowered his rifle hammer and jumped down to the riverbank. "What are you doing here, son?" he asked, extending a massive hand. Johnston pointed to his trap. "Heard in St. Joe that trapping is good around here." Hatcher roared with laughter. "That's a rich one. This place was trapped out back in 25. He studied the greenhorn, Robidoux's latest victim, and saw potential. Kicking the trap with disdain, he said, "Come with me, lad, but leave that junk. Where we're going, we make our own traps." He then examined Johnston's horse, checking its legs, teeth, and reflexes with a critical eye. "Wonders never cease," he muttered. "How did old Joe sell you a sound, fiery horse like this?" That night, the new partners ate boiled, jerked venison by a campfire on the open plains. Hatcher, always eager to talk, spoke of the mountains and the men who lived there. Johnston listened intently, his natural silence fitting well with the older man's wisdom. The next morning, as they rode west, Hatcher pointed to the Oto tomahawk Robidoux had gifted. "Don't use it unless you have to," he advised. Seeing Johnston's confusion, he added, "Spoils the scalp." He explained that dressed scalps fetched a high price in English markets. "Why?" the young trapper asked. "Reckon they hang them in their parlors," Hatcher guessed. They pushed hard for the mountains, needing to reach Uinta country before snow blocked the divide. They camped only after dark and rode out before dawn. On the trail, Hatcher was silent and vigilant, eyes scanning the horizon, nose to the wind. But at night, with horses staked and feet near the fire, he poured out his wilderness knowledge. "Always remember, youngster," Hatcher repeated, "never give a red enemy a chance. And always count coup first, or you'll be gone beaver, dead." Johnston would soon prove he could heed such warnings. One afternoon, as they entered the foothills, a dozen Arapahoes descended upon them. Johnston took an arrow in his right shoulder during the first volley, but still managed to drop one attacker, while Hatcher killed two. The remaining Indians fled out of range. Johnston started forward to count coup, but was stopped. "Let's get that arrow out first," Hatcher said. He used his bowie knife to remove the shaft and a chunk of flesh. Johnston stood like a statue. "Curse me for a Kiowa, have you no feelings?" That was deep. Johnston simply reloaded his rifle. Never approach a dead Indian with an empty gun, Hatcher had taught him. They walked toward the fallen warriors. Hatcher took the moment to lecture on Arapaho nature. "These ones are more treacherous than most. One is still living," Johnston noted. Hatcher drew his bowie. As Johnston pointed, the wounded brave tried to pull his scalping knife, but was too late. The mountain man's blade struck his chest. "Now," Hatcher said, "let's get on." He cleaned his knife in the earth, then stepped on his victim's face, twisted the scalp lock around his hand, and cut a circle around the top knot. With a sharp yank, the scalp came free with a snapping sound. Hatcher cleaned it and slipped it through his belt ring, bloody side up. "Dries quicker this way, now let's see you try." As Johnston bent to the task, he felt the old trapper's gaze boring into him, but he was a quick study. He performed the act cleanly and surely. As he snapped the trophy free, Hatcher spoke, sounding surprised. "Never scalped a wild Indian before, lad?" "Never saw one before." "Then curse me for a Kiowa. You're built better for this work than any man I ever saw." Hatcher looked toward the mountains. "First time I skinned one, I was cold and shaking all over." He watched Johnston mount his horse and tie the top knot to his bridle. "Slicing a man doesn't bother me," Johnston said. Hatcher would later comment on the emptiness in his partner's eyes. Johnston did possess enough sentiment to keep that first scalp stretched on a hoop in his kit. Years later, in 1871, he would identify it for White-Eye Anderson. If Hatcher taught Johnston how to kill, he also taught him the value, or profit, of befriending certain tribes. He told a rambling story of saving a Shoshone chief's son from a puma that had mauled the boy. It was an incident Johnston would remember in the years to come. An apprenticeship. When John Johnston entered the mountains alongside old Hatcher, the golden age of the beaver trade was fading. With beaver scarce, the trappers turned their attention to other game. They found themselves in increasing competition with the agents of the Hudson's Bay Company and the despised Boughton Frenchies, derisively called mangeurs du lard, pork eaters, who encroached on the territory of the fiercely independent American mountain men. Hatcher, a specialist in trapping bear and mink, guided Johnston into this new phase of the trade. These early years forged Johnston's identity. While he naturally developed his own unique combat style, specifically his devastating kicks, and honed his physical senses to a preternatural level, he was fundamentally a student of the masters. His teachers included Hatcher, Bill Williams, Del Gouet, and Bear Claw, Chris Lapp. The legend of liver-eating Johnson was not born fully formed. As Johnston himself later admitted, he had to learn the trade before he could master the mountains. From the beginning, his sharp wits and immense strength set him apart. While trapping in the Book-Cliff Mountains of the western slope, these attributes saved Hatcher's life. Hatcher had shot a grizzly, but the wound only enraged the massive beast. Charging from close range, the bear gave the old trapper no time to reload. Johnston fired, but his shot also failed to stop the animal. With no other option, he drew his bowie knife and stepped between the charging grizzly and his partner, who was scrambling for a tree. The bear, a giant male, reared up to crush this new threat. Johnston ducked beneath a sweeping claw and drove his blade deep into the animal's heart. As the bear faltered, Johnston sprinted for Hatcher's tree, leaving his knife buried in the beast's chest. "Smart trick," Hatcher noted later, crediting Johnston with tactical brilliance. "Leave the blade in and the bear bleeds out inside." Johnston, who rarely accepted praise for simple necessity, replied dryly, "There wasn't any time to pull it out." Their first season's catch was hauled from the Wintahs to Hatcher's cabin in the Little Snake Valley, located in what is now northwestern Colorado. There, Hatcher, aided by his 2 Cheyenne wives, processed the furs. In a gesture of hospitality, Hatcher offered Johnston one of the women for the winter. He also passed down the valley's violent history, recounting the death of Henry Old Frap Frabe at Battle Mountain and his own experiences at Battle Creek. Johnston declined the offer of the woman. Displaying a level of delicacy that surprised the older man, he insisted on building his own sleeping quarters, a lean-to attached to the main cabin. Hatcher helped him build it, but then promptly moved the women into the lean-to and insisted Johnston sleep in the main cabin. The lean-to, Hatcher declared, was good enough for Indians. The cabin became a way station for other trappers passing through the region, allowing Johnston to meet the elite of the wilderness. He observed their camaraderie, but also noted how frequently their visits were cut short by violent death. Among the regulars was Bear Claw, Chris Lapp, a veteran of the Sublette Brigade. When Hatcher rode off to Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River to trade, Johnston partnered with Bear Claw. Despite Johnston's surly reputation, he and Lapp forged a strong friendship. Lapp's nickname came from his obsession with making necklaces from grizzly claws, trophies saved for him by hunters across the West. When Johnston presented him with the claws from one of his first grizzly kills, a gift facilitated by Hatcher, the old artisan exclaimed his signature phrase of approval, "Great Jehoshaphat, Pocahontas, and John Smith." Lapp also served as a historian, telling Johnston about John Coulter's discovery of the Yellowstone geysers. That is what old Coulter stood for when he discovered these. "Boilings," Chris explained to a silent Johnston. Later on, Coulter had to run 100 miles from the Indians. "Why had to?" Johnston asked. It took considerable effort for Chris to convince the young giant that there were times when running from an entire tribe was the only sensible option. On one trip, they encountered the legendary Bill Williams camped on the Sweetwater. Old Bill, headed for Fort Laramie, wanted company, but Bear Claw had other plans. They parted ways after Bear Claw accepted 2 sets of grizzly claws from Williams with his usual thunderous catchphrase. Williams was even more silent than Johnston. After they separated, Chris felt compelled to fill the silence by recounting Old Bill's exploits himself. During these apprentice years, Johnston reached his physical peak. Even the strongest mountain men respected his 6'2" frame and 240 pounds of hard muscle. W.F. Skyhawk described Johnston's hands as big as a half bushel of Montana wheat, noting that he could hold his own against any 2 men in a brawl. Skyhawk claimed that with one turn, he could twist an Indian's neck off. Delguay witnessed Johnston kill a Sioux warrior instantly in a trade dispute by dashing him to the ground, and then reportedly kill 5 more with his bare fists in the ensuing melee. Johnston also developed a fighting technique that demoralized his enemies, the kick. He struck so swiftly and with such crushing power that no defense seemed possible. At the 1846 rendezvous on the Green River, Delguay watched as Johnston killed 2 Indians simultaneously using this method. Appointed to the camp police during a gathering of trappers and Indians, Johnston was tasked with suppressing the blood feuds that frequently erupted. On one occasion, he found a Blackfoot and a Shoshone, ancient tribal enemies, circling each other with knives. Johnston neutralized both with tremendous kicks, then seized them by their necks. Before they could recover, he smashed their heads, together with such force that bystanders believed their necks snapped before impact. Both warriors dropped dead, and the tribal police carried them away. Under the tutelage of men like Hatcher and Lapp, Johnston learned to read the Rockies like a scholar reads a book. He became inured to hardship and developed an uncanny ability to detect danger. His companions claimed he was the greatest man-trailer in the mountains, a skill Johnston attributed to his sense of smell. It was said He could walk around the cold ashes of a campfire, estimate the number of warriors who had been there, and identify their tribe by scent alone. Some peers felt his suspicious nature bordered on paranoia, ensuring he was never caught off guard. Others wondered if his perceptiveness came from a total lack of fear, allowing his senses to remain unclouded. He never sought trouble, but he never shied away from it. To Johnston, trapping was a trade, the mountains were home, and killing those who threatened either was simply a routine necessity. But what of the sheer number of Indians he killed? He would likely argue that they declared themselves his enemies first. He would point out that he admired many tribes, including the Crows, and had trusted his life to Indian honor on several occasions. He might also note that he prided himself on never having killed a white man, and, if forced to justify his existence, he would surely mention the people he protected, such as the crazy woman and her husband. But how would he explain the specific indignity he visited upon his fallen foes, the eating of their raw livers? Perhaps the liver eater would say nothing at all. Or perhaps he would suggest that even in his terrible vendetta, there was a strange sort of order, a method to the madness that separated him from mere savagery. A madness. In the early days of his trapping career, John Johnston operated a mundane but lucrative side business. 5 miles upstream from the mouth of the Musselshell River in central Montana, he established a wood yard. During lean trapping seasons, he cut, dried, and stacked cordwood to fuel the Missouri River steamboats. The captains would wood up and leave payment in paper money tucked inside a knothole of a cottonwood tree, a wilderness bank vault. In the summer of 1846, Johnston returned to this spot with Bigfoot Davis after a profitable trading expedition among the Flatheads. During the trip, a sub-chief had offered Johnston his daughter in trade, an offer Johnston declined at the time. Finding his tree safe undisturbed, Johnston collected his earnings. The two men parted ways. Davis headed down the Missouri to a trading post, while Johnston rode south along the Musselshell. Unbeknownst to him, he was riding directly toward a scene of horror. John Morgan had been a farmer in Connecticut before the call of the West uprooted him. He moved his family to Independence, Missouri, stocked a wagon, and joined a train on the Oregon Trail. All went well, until they reached Nebraska, near the present-day town of Beatrice. There, Morgan quarreled with the wagon master and, in a fit of stubborn independence, decided to strike out alone. It was a fatal error. To leave the safety of the prairie schooner caravan, with only a wife, 2 young sons, and an 18-year-old daughter, was to invite disaster. The Morgans traveled some 700 miles northwest, reaching the Musselshell without incident. When the heat warped their wagon wheels and broke several spokes, Morgan halted to make repairs. He soaked the wheels in the river to swell the wood back into place, a task that took a few days. But rather than moving on immediately, the family decided to rest for a week. They built a lean-to, fished, and grazed their oxen. On the 3rd evening of their rest, Morgan went to fetch the oxen and did not return. His wife sent the 2 boys after him. When they too vanished, she sent her daughter. Shortly after the girl disappeared into the brush, Mrs. Morgan heard a scream. Grabbing an axe from the wagon bed, the mother ran toward the grazing grounds. She stumbled into a nightmare. A dozen Blackfoot warriors had descended upon her family. John Morgan was tied to a sycamore tree, barely alive, a crude gash atop his head where a tomahawk had ripped away his scalp. Their sons lay dead, also scalped. The warriors were in the process of attacking the daughter when Mrs. Morgan arrived. When the warriors saw the woman charging them, axe raised high, they hesitated. They saw the madness in her eyes, a spirit sickness that terrified them. In her grief-fueled berserker rage, she was no longer a settler woman, but a demon. She fell upon them, hacking wildly. So great was their superstitious terror that she managed to kill 4 of the braves before the rest fled. In their haste, they tomahawked the daughter and dragged the semi-conscious John Morgan away with them, dropping his scalp in the grass as they retreated. John Johnston arrived at the scene as the sun was setting. He quickly assessed the carnage. Dismounting, he picketed his horse and pack animals, heavy with trade goods from the Big Horns. He tried to speak to Mrs. Morgan, but her mind had snapped. She was beyond reason. He stayed to help her dig 4 graves. In 3, they buried the children and the husband's scalp. At the head of each grave, Johnston drove a sharpened post. He stood by and watched as Mrs. Morgan mounted the severed heads of the 4 Blackfoot warriors she had killed onto the posts. Johnston remained for 3 days, building a sturdy log cabin for the widow. He moved her belongings inside, stocked it with some of his own provisions, and realized there was nothing more he could do. As he later told Hatcher, he left her there, a crazy woman guarding her dead. That winter on the Little Snake was a lonely one for Johnston. Hatcher had decided to move on, announcing his intention to head for Santa Fe and perhaps California to lay his bones beside the sea. Hatcher sent his Cheyenne wives back to their people with ample supplies and gifts, gave Johnston the cabin and its contents, and rode southeast. He warned Johnston to watch his topknot and never looked back. Johnston, now the sole master of the cabin, couldn't understand why a mountain man would want to die in a land as alien as California. Johnston planned to trap the coming season with Del Guay, a flamboyant mountain man with twisting mustachios who had once ridden with Wyeth's New Englanders. But before Del arrived, Johnston discovered that the solitary life in the cabin had lost its appeal. Though he ran a woodyard, he despised cutting wood for himself. He hated cooking. Despite his dour nature, he missed the company of Hatcher and the Cheyenne women. Visitors passing through brought news that the crazy woman had become a frontier legend. Mrs. Morgan remained in the cabin Johnston had built, refusing all offers to move to a settlement. She guarded the graves. As the buzzards picked the 4 skulls clean and the sun bleached them white, it was said she hunted in the river breaks for food and that mountain men left gifts at her door. Johnston himself would visit periodically under the cover of darkness, leaving supplies and departing unseen. The Blackfeet, fearful of her madness, gave the cabin a wide berth. Johnston also learned a secret that he shared with no one. John Morgan had survived. Whether Morgan had escaped the Blackfeet or been discarded by them was unclear, but he never returned to the Musselshell to find his wife. Perhaps he too had lost his mind or his memory. In the code of the mountains, a man's survival and his silence were his own business. Johnston kept the knowledge to himself, and the legend of the crazy woman grew, undisturbed by the truth. Oath of Vengeance. In the spring of 1847, Del Guay sensed a change in his partner. Typically, trapping partners would part ways for the season to maximize their coverage and minimize risk, agreeing to meet later to split the profits. The plan was for Del to head to the Big Snow Mountains while Johnston returned to his stronghold in the Uintas. But Johnston had a different agenda. "Take the furs into Laramie, Del," Johnston said, entrusting his partner with the massive winter haul. He offered no further explanation, and Del, knowing better than to pry, accepted the task. Perhaps Del had heard rumors of the Flathead sub-chief who had once offered Johnston his daughter. Johnston, now a man of substance with a cabin, horses, rifles, and a stockpile of trade goods, rode off toward the Wind River Range while Del headed for the trading post. Johnston arrived at the Flathead encampment in early May. He went straight to the lodge of Bear's Head, the sub-chief he had befriended the previous year. His loaded pack horses spoke for him, signaling his prosperity and intent. First came the rituals of protocol. Johnston distributed gifts liberally among Bear's Head's extended family, mother, sisters, cousins. Once the generosity was established, Bear's Head formally received the proposal. Johnston wanted his daughter. The chief retreated to his lodge to meditate on the offer, leaving Johnston to attend a dog feast. The bargaining process consumed 3 days, finally settling on a bride price of 1 rifle, 2 knives, and a supply of salt and sugar. After another week of ceremony, Johnston departed with his new wife, the Swan, amidst a roaring send-off. The Swan was a striking woman, her head shaped naturally rather than flattened by the traditional cradleboard rock, a detail that perhaps contributed to her beauty in the eyes of the white trappers. She was likely relieved to be the bride of a free trapper rather than a Hudson's Bay Frenchie, whose reputation for stinginess and brutality was well known. On the trail, they fell into a rhythm. Johnston smoked his pipe while she set up camp, following the custom of the land. But in other ways, he defied convention. He gave her a Tennessee rifle and an unlimited supply of powder, teaching her to shoot. He dedicated himself to learning the Flathead language, mastering it quickly. They took their time crossing the Owl Creeks and the Big Horns, cutting through the heart of Crow territory and crossing the Yellowstone to the Musselshell. They found Delguay waiting at the old camp. Del greeted the Swan with a twist of his mustache and no sign of surprise. He reported that he had left supplies for the crazy woman. The partners split their earnings, Johnston's share was substantial, and Del departed for the Big Snows. Johnston and the Swan rode for the cabin on the Little Snake. They had only a few weeks of domestic life before the trapping season called Johnston away. He used the time to ensure the Swan's comfort. He built a corral for her pony and his spare horses and cleared the brush behind the cabin down to the riverbank. The Swan adopted elements of her husband's culture, baking biscuits with white flour while fashioning him moccasins in the Flathead style. As the aspen leaves turned and the air grew crisp, Johnston prepared to leave for the Uintas. He would not return until the spring runoff. At the time of his departure, the Swan had not yet told him she was carrying his child. She watched him ride his black colt down the valley until he disappeared, then turned back to the solitude of the cabin. The winter was long and harsh. The Swan hunted small game and gathered driftwood, surviving the deep snows in the comfort of the cabin. She knew her husband would return with the floods of spring. What she did not know was that a war party of young Crow braves was moving down from the mountains behind the cabin. They came silently, a score of untried warriors seeking glory. They likely approached single file along the river shelf, hidden by the rough terrain. The Swan was sitting outside on a rude bench, enjoying the spring air, perhaps, working on a moccasin. The Crows waited until she stepped inside the cabin for a moment, using the distraction to move into position. When she emerged, pregnant and slow-moving, she stood no chance. She may have sensed a presence or caught a glimpse of war paint, but the tomahawk struck before she could react. She fell from the bench. Her killer claimed her scalp. The Crows looted the cabin, stripping it of everything except a copper kettle hidden inside a covered stool. They took the horses and the Swan's pony. Strangely, they did not burn the structure, perhaps hoping the owner would return and fall into a future trap. Johnston was indeed returning, his mind filled with plans for a summer of ease. He told Del later that he had intended to take his wife to Fort Laramie to trade and rest. He was coming home a wealthy man, his pack horses laden with a second consecutive bumper crop of furs. But as he neared the river bend that hid his cabin from view, his instincts flared. He dismounted and led his horses into the rocks, securing them and stripping their loads. Then, moving with the silence of a ghost, he crept through the leafless aspen grove toward the clearing. He dropped to his hands and knees for the final approach. The silence was absolute. No smoke rose from the chimney. In front of the cabin, on the rock floor, lay scattered bones. Johnston stepped into the open, his Hawken rifle cocked. A massive vulture flapped its wings and lumbered into the sky from behind the cabin. Near the door lay the clean-picked skull of the Flathead girl. Nearby, torn apart by scavengers, lay the tiny, fragile remains of the unborn child. 2 were killed here, he whispered. Johnston scanned the ground. He found the trail where the horses had been hidden and where the warriors had applied their paint. He found a single eagle feather. "Crow," he muttered, "or this child never trapped a beaver." He entered the cabin and found the hidden kettle. He brought it outside, sniffing the air to ensure he was alone. Then, with a grim reverence, he gathered the bones of his wife and child and placed them, along with the crow feather, inside the kettle. He carried the vessel to a deep crevice in the rocks and walled it in with stones, creating a tomb safe from wolves and bears. By the time he returned to his horses, dusk had fallen. He loaded his gear and rode for Battle Mountain, making a cold camp in the high peaks to avoid any lingering enemies. That night, under the shadow of the mountain where Henry Frabe had fallen, John Johnston changed. The young trapper died, and something else took his place. He swore a terrible oath that he would extract a price for this loss. He would not rest until the crows had paid in blood, and the payment would be heavy. The vendetta had begun. A man's reputation. By 1848, the first whispers of Johnston's terrifying campaign began to drift through the West. Across vast territories where white men seldom ventured, the iron bodies of Crow warriors, and only Crow warriors, were discovered in a distinct state of mutilation. They were not merely scalped, they were sliced open beneath the ribs, and their livers had been removed. When pressed for answers, mountain men like Del Guay, Bearclaw Chris, and Bigfoot Davis offered a grim explanation. Johnston was eating them. Why he did it remained a mystery to most. Few knew he had ever taken a wife, let alone that she had been murdered. So brief was their time together. The truth of his motive only entered the general consciousness of the wilderness because of a lone Indian spy who, by chance, witnessed Johnston visiting his secret cache of bones. Inevitably, the vendetta could not be kept quiet. Within months, John Johnston ceased to be a mere trapper and became the Crow Killer, Dapiak Absaroka, or more infamously, Liver-Eating Johnson. The gold seekers of 49, passing through the mountains on their way to California, picked up the tales and carried them to the coast. Mountain men turned the story into an epic. Many of them had been forced by starvation to eat human flesh, usually limbs, but never internal organs as a matter of ritual vengeance. In lonely outposts, frustrated mothers frightened unruly children into obedience with the threat, "Behave, or I'll get Liver-Eating Johnson to come for you with his knife." When the man himself appeared at places like Fort Laramie to trade, the wives of soldiers and settlers bolted their doors and peeked through the shutters. They shuddered at the sight of the solitary giant with the flaming red beard, imagining it stained darker with blood. To them, he was a walking specter of death, his eyes holding a cold gray gleam that chilled the blood. He was proscribed, feared, and hated, yet universally respected, the loneliest figure in a lonely land. When Johnson arrived to trade, he slapped crow scalps and high-quality furs onto the counters. Traders fought for his business. In exchange, he demanded vast quantities of powder and lead, but surprisingly little flour or meal. He bought coffee, sugar, and salt. The purchase of salt spawned a dark whispered joke among those safe enough to mock him from a distance. "Does he salt them Indian livers?" No one dared ask him to his face. In Johnson's presence, men gave him a wide berth. Johnson rode into Fort Laramie in 1851, the same year the federal government signed a treaty with the tribes there, a treaty that defined Crow lands, boundaries that meant nothing to Johnson or his enemies. Del Guay and Bearclaw Chris saw him there briefly. Del noted his equipment with a professional eye. Johnson still carried the .30 caliber Hawken he had bought from Robidoux, a weapon he trusted implicitly. But now, hanging from his belt, was a matched set of lethal instruments, a Colt Walker revolver and a massive Bowie knife with a 14-inch blade, both featuring polished rosewood handles. Rumor held that these weapons had originally been crafted for the famous Irish sportsman Sir George Gore. Everything Johnston wore, his fringed buckskins, his moccasins, was of Crow manufacture, stripped from the bodies of the warriors who had fallen to his gun or knife. As he stood before his old friends, he embodied the pride and ferocity of the mountain man, but he possessed none of the camaraderie. Bear Claw, who hadn't seen his friend in years, approached him with an offer to partner up for a trapping expedition. Johnston's reply was curt. He had other business. He turned and strode away. When Chris moved to follow, Del Guay grabbed his arm and held him back. "Can't you tell?" Del whispered. "He's on a trail." The Crow killer walked to the feedlot where he had stabled his horse. A crowd had gathered to gawk at the animal, a massive black stallion with a reputation of its own. It was said the horse would stand guard while its master slept, that it hated Indians and could scent them from miles away, and that it allowed no man but Johnston within kicking distance. The spectators watched in silence as the beast nuzzled the red-bearded giant. Johnston saddled the animal, tied on his supplies, and mounted. Without a backward glance, he laid his hawken across the saddle and turned the black horse's nose toward the west. "Where is he going?" someone asked. "Wherever it is," came the answer. "You can bet there are crows there. He's on a death trail." There were indeed crows where Johnston was headed. He knew exactly where they were, and he rode with a singular, terrible purpose. Men were beginning to learn that the liver-eater never saddled his horse without a reason. Twined scalps. By the mid-19th century, the Crow lands remained much as the explorer Larocque had described them 50 years earlier. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 formalized their boundaries, starting at the mouth of the Powder River on the Yellowstone, tracing up the Powder to its source along the main range of the Black Hills and Wind River Mountains to the Yellowstone's headwaters and down to the mouth of 25-Yard Creek. From there, the line ran to the headwaters of the Musselshell, down to its mouth, and finally to the headwaters of Big Dry Creek. But the Crows who murdered the Swan had ridden far beyond these borders, and the Crow killer was prepared to follow them wherever they went, treaty lines be damned. Far to the west, beyond Fort Benton and the headwaters of the Missouri, lay the wild, game-rich country of the Bitterroot Mountains. This was technically Flathead territory, a contested hunting ground closed to the Crows except for specific business or war. Yet every spring, the Crows ventured here. The Crow people were a paradox. They were proud, brave, and physically imposing. Unlike the constantly warring Blackfeet, they were not naturally quarrelsome. Crow men were devoted fathers, and their counsel listened to the wisdom of their women, a trait other tribes mocked as weakness. They were skilled artisans known for their superior tanning and preferred trade to raiding. While generally peaceful, they were ferocious when attacked, usually taking more scalps than they lost. The eastern faction of the tribe, Plains hunters led by a whiskey-loving chief who spent more time at trading posts than with his people, was less disciplined. But the Western Crows, particularly those led by the famed Chief Big Robert, embodied the nobility and strength that made their nation legendary. It was these Western Crows that Johnston hunted. Big Robert had dispatched 50 of his elite warriors to the Bitterroots to trade for horses with the Flatheads. Their packs bulged with buffalo robes, grizzly claw necklaces, and exquisite beadwork. They sought the finest mountain-bred horses in exchange. The cavalcade moved with military precision, flanked by scouts and vedettes. Trailing them on his big black horse, sitting in a crow saddle and scanning the horizon with predator eyes, was liver-eating Johnston. Tracking such a large column was child's play for him. He had no intention of engaging 50 seasoned warriors in open combat. As he later admitted, such a move would have been suicidal. Instead, he waited for the perfect moment to strike. He found it at the forks of the Beaverhead River. Finding the warm ashes of their campfire, Johnston dismounted. He tied horsehide mufflers over his mount's hooves to silence its steps. Leaving the main trail, he flanked the column, moving slowly and silently to avoid detection by rear guards. His caution was rewarded when a Crow scout galloped past on the trail he had just vacated. At nightfall, he spotted the reflection of campfires against a canyon wall where a tributary met the Beaver Head. After securing his horse, he climbed to a rimrock overlooking the camp. From this vantage point, he studied the layout and formulated his plan. He returned to his horse, unsaddled it, and tethered it on a long line. After a meal of cold buffalo jerky, he slept in a thicket for a few hours, trusting the horse to act as a sentry. Long before dawn, he was back on the rimrock. Below, the camp slept. 2 sentries were posted, one idly tending the dying fires, the other pacing a monotonous beat between the camp and the horse herd. The horses, highly trained, were loosely picketed. Some had pulled their pins and wandered near a stack of trade goods. This stack would be Johnson's cover. Johnson knew he couldn't use his revolver. The noise would wake the camp before he could scatter the horses. His Bowie knife was silent, but a dying man might cry out. He needed something immediate and crushing. He picked up a stone the size of a small pumpkin and waited. The sentry was a giant of a man. He walked his beat, glancing at the horses before turning back toward the camp. As he passed within 4 steps of Johnson's hiding spot behind the trade goods, the liver eater hurled the rock. It struck the warrior just below his single eagle feather. The man collapsed instantly, the only sound the hiss of air leaving his lungs. Johnson dragged the unconscious body into the brush at the edge of the ravine. He then moved among the horses, whispering to calm them as he pulled their picket pins. Once they were free, he threw handfuls of pebbles into the herd and let out a piercing yell. As the horses stampeded, terrified by the sudden noise and the scent of a stranger, the canyon erupted in chaos. The Crow warriors scrambled from their robes, shouting orders. A sub-chief rallied a dozen men to chase the runaway herd. In the confusion, no one noticed Johnson slipping back into the timber, the unconscious sentry thrown over his shoulder. 30 minutes later, miles away, Johnson stood over his captive. He efficiently scalped the man, then slit his throat to ensure death. As he stripped the warrior's gear, Johnson noticed a bullhide belt around the man's waist. From it dangled a long, dried scalp of thick black hair. For a moment, Johnson imagined it belonged to a white woman from a wagon train. But as he examined it in the morning light, recognition slammed into him. The texture, the color, it was familiar. This was the scalp of the swan. He had found her killer. With cold precision, Johnson braided the fresh scalp of the warrior together with the old scalp of his wife. He tied the twined trophies to his bridle. As he prepared to mount, he remembered his oath. He drew his Bowie knife. Stooping over the body, he made the deep incision beneath the ribs. He reached in, grasped the liver, and tore it free. Wiping the blade on his thumb, he sheathed it. Blood dripped from his red beard as he rode away to the northwest. He had avenged his wife's murder, but the account was far from settled. He had put 50 Crow warriors on foot, buying himself time to reach the Flatheads. He knew the Swan's people would agree one scalp was not enough. They would welcome the chance to share in the vengeance. Crow against Flathead. Johnston knew the clock was ticking. The 50 Crow warriors he had set afoot would recover their scattered horses within a day or two. He had to reach the Flatheads before the Crows arrived for their trade, and he had delicate diplomatic work to do. He rode relentlessly, sleeping little, pushing his big black horse to the breaking point. As the foothills of the Bitterroots came into view, the animal faltered. 5 miles from the Flathead encampment, the horse stumbled and couldn't rise. Johnston dismounted, drew his Walker Colt, and ended the animal's suffering with a single shot. He threw his saddle and bridle over his shoulder and covered the remaining distance on foot, aided near the end by some Indian boys hunting lizards. The Flathead camp was tucked into a secluded verdant valley, a natural fortress, perfect for grazing the 500 horses they intended to trade. Johnston passed through the narrow, guarded entrance between high rock walls. Inside, the valley was a hive of activity as 50 mounted warriors sorted the trade herd. Johnston ignored them, striding directly toward the lodge of Bear's Head, his father-in-law and now the principal chief of the tribe. After the guards announced the arrival of the white relative, Johnston entered the lodge. Bear's Head rose from a buffalo robe and placed his hand over Johnston's heart. Johnston reciprocated, the formal Flathead greeting for kin. The chief signaled for a pipe. A woman brought tobacco and a coal, then vanished. The two men smoked in silence for 5 minutes, the blue smoke drifting toward the smoke hole. Finally, Bear's Head tapped the ash onto the earthen floor. It was time to speak. Johnston spoke in the Flathead tongue, a skill that caused the old chief's eyes to flicker with surprise. He produced 2 objects from his bag. One was fresh, the other was old and brittle. He handed the older scalp to the chief. Bear's Head took it. His weathered fingers traced the long, black strands. A shudder passed through him. "It is the swan," he said softly. Johnston nodded. "Many suns have passed." Johnston picked up a handful of dirt and let it sift through his fingers, signifying the passage of time. He then handed the chief the fresh scalp, the one he had taken from the Crow sentry. Bear's Head saw that the two had been braided together. The symbolism was clear. The debt had begun to be paid. "Do they belong together?" the chief asked. Johnston nodded again. The old man's eyes hardened with a cold, ancient hate. "Where are the others? The ones who came with this one to kill my daughter?" "There were 50, the Crow killer said. 49 come to trade tomorrow." Bear's Head's voice dropped to a whisper like dry leaves in a wind. "My warriors will be ready. We will trade death. We will settle this account." "They call you Dapiek Absaroka now, my son," the chief added. "You have avenged my daughter. Now, my people will finish it." 2 hours later, Johnston rode out of the valley on a fresh, long-limbed black 3-year-old he had selected from the herd. Flathead scouts were already racing to track the approaching crows. At the narrow pass, 200 warriors were preparing an ambush. Johnston knew the odds were now heavily in the Flathead's favor, so he turned his horse south toward the Snake River Plains. He had business with Wani, the Fox, chief of the Northern Shoshone. The Northern Shoshone were a proud people, distinct from their impoverished relatives known as diggers. They were currently camped on the Lost River. As Johnston rode through the desolate volcanic landscape, he was overtaken by 2 Shoshone braves. Recognizing the famous scalp hunter, they joined him. Johnston noted with grim irony that hanging from their belts were fresh Flathead scalps. He allowed them to ride ahead during the day, and at night he slept with one eye open. When they arrived at the encampment, the village erupted in excitement. Dogs barked and warriors clamored to greet the great white brave who eats crow livers. But there was confusion when they saw their own tribesmen returning with Johnston, bearing the scalps of his in-laws. Johnston was escorted to the lodge of the Fox. After the initial greetings, Johnston got straight to the point. He gestured to the 2 braves who had accompanied him. "Each carries a Flathead scalp," Johnston said. "They fought alongside the crows. Your enemies are the same as mine." Wani picked up a gourd rattle and shook it. The Flatheads were allies of the Shoshone. The crows were enemies to both. And Johnston was a man to whom the tribe owed a debt. At the sound of the rattle, a young warrior entered the lodge. A jagged scar ran from his ear to his chin. "Your son?" Johnston asked. The Fox nodded. He gave a guttural command, and the young man left silently. "Many moons ago," the Fox said, "my son was lost while hunting. A mountain lion attacked him. He would have died, but a rifle ball killed the beast. The shot was fired by Hatcher." His black stallion was draped in a white buffalo robe and outfitted with a beaded crow saddle. Johnston himself wore a magnificent suit of white doeskin, fringed and quilled, a beaver cap, and new moccasins. His belt, holding the Walker Colt and the Bowie knife, was heavy with trophies. The warriors had feasted on his success, and the Crows had paid a terrible price. 60 Flatheads had died in the fighting, proving the Crows' prowess even when outnumbered. But the message was clear. The Crow killer's reach was long. Riding back along the Little Snake River toward his old cabin, Johnston passed the landmarks of his tragedy, the bend where he last saw the swan, the glen where he taught her to shoot. As he approached his clearing, he saw smoke rising from the chimney. Instantly wary, Johnston leveled his hawken at the door and charged, dropping the lid ropes of his pack horses. He was ready to kill the intruder when he spotted a familiar, ugly horse in the corral. "Hold up there, partner, before you drill me." Del Guay stepped out of the cabin, hands raised in peace. Johnston lowered the hammer of his rifle and dismounted, looking slightly embarrassed. "Thought at first you were a Crow chief," Del said, eyeing the resplendent white leathers and the dangling scalps. "With all those trappings, I almost shot you myself." Winter holiday, spring council. 36 scalps were as good as gold bullion in the mountains, and liver-eating Johnson was a thrifty man with few vices. Upon returning to his cabin, he stripped off his splendid white crow-skin suit and donned his old grease-stained leathers. He was a teetotaler, and his needs were simple. He decided to spend the winter quietly. Though he staked Del Guay with 200 pounds of coffee, sugar, salt, and dried fish, the cost of these provisions amounted to only 11 scalps traded at Bridger's Post. He intended to set his house in order, literally and spiritually. Del took the supplies and a gift horse to ease the burden on his jughead mount and set off for the cabin on the Musselshell. The snow held off late that year. When the gray clouds finally gathered, threatening a storm, Johnston rose from his stool by the fireplace. He took a beaded doeskin bag from a peg on the wall. Opening it, he withdrew a pair of scalps, the hair braided together so tightly they seemed one. He fingered the glossy black hair of the swan and the coarse strands of her killer, noting the distinctive feather and ornaments attached to the latter. He stepped out into the biting air and walked down the valley to his secret cache among the rocks. For a long time, the trapper sat by the crevice, holding two skulls, one of a woman, round and smooth, and the other, tiny and fragile, the remains of an unborn child. It is almost certain that Johnston knew he was being watched. He possessed an uncanny sixth sense for danger. It is hard to believe he would sit exposed, fondling these macabre relics without sensing the eyes upon him. It is likely he allowed the spy, a lone Indian scout, to see. He wanted the story told. He wanted the world to know that his vendetta was not random. The spy watched as the red-bearded giant sat in the silence, communing with his dead. Finally, Johnston placed the skulls and the crow feather back into the kettle, returned it to the niche, and carefully sealed the tomb with stones. He strode back to his cabin without looking back, and no arrow flew from the brush. The spy vanished, but the story traveled. The Indian had seen the large skull, the tiny skull, and the crow feather. The message was clear. The liver-eater's war was personal, and his kills were not accidental. When this story circulated through the trading posts and army camps, the perception of Johnston shifted. To the lonely white women on the frontier, he was no longer a monster, but a tragic figure, a man driven by a terrible love for his murdered wife and child. They began to speak of him with a shuddering respect, but to the tribe surrounding the Crows, the story was a source of brutal comedy. The great Crow nation was being dismantled by a single white hunter. As the deep snow finally buried the valley, Johnston settled into a rhythm of solitude. One morning, he woke to find the snow piled high against his door. He fashioned a wooden shovel, dug a tunnel to the corral to feed his horses, and then retreated back into his fortress. He spent the long, silent days maintaining his arsenal. He dismantled his Walker Colt, oiled it with whale oil purchased at Laramie, and reloaded it. He honed his Bowie knife on sandstone and cured horsehide until the edge could split a hair floating in the air. He sewed moccasins with bone needles, crafting double-layered pairs with buffalo hair, lining the inside for warmth. Essential gear for a man who fought with his feet as well as his steel. The story of the spy at the grave spread across the plains. Some said the watcher was Cheyenne, others Blackfoot or Arapaho. But all tribes took delight in retelling it. From the arrogant Sioux to the wily Apache, the tale grew. The Crows became the laughingstock of the wilderness. Rival tribes mocked them mercilessly. Sioux warriors would block the path of Crow hunters, drawing a finger across their own abdomens and sneering, "Isan Tanka," big knife. The Crows, a proud people, found themselves fighting deadly duels just to silence the insults. The Crow elders were desperate. They condemned the reckless youths who had started this war by killing the swan, but regret would not stop the slaughter. Johnston had made it clear he would not settle for a conventional peace. The humiliation was becoming unbearable. Big Robert, the principal chief, called a war council. He was a majestic figure, wearing a headdress of buffalo horns. Though older now, he was still a formidable warrior, famous for once killing a mother grizzly with nothing but a knife. Stung by the mockery of the Sioux, he enforced strict discipline at the council, barring children and dogs and admitting only the most venerable women. His own aged mother, a woman of great influence, hobbled in to sit near the medicine men. The council debated strategy. Big Robert knew that sending a large army against Johnston was futile. The Crow killer would simply smell them coming and vanish, or pick them off from the shadows. To send 100 men to kill one would only invite further ridicule. Big Robert made a hard decision. They would not use overwhelming force. Instead, they would use the Crows' greatest asset, individual bravery. They would send 20 chosen warriors, the best of the best, to hunt Johnston down. But they would not go as a group. They would go one by one. They would act as human-guided missiles, each seeking a single chance to kill the Dapiek Absaroka. It was a suicide mission. Big Robert's mother moved among the assembled braves, her black eyes snapping. With intensity, she made the selections. She chose one for his rash courage, another for his cunning, a third for his speed, and a fourth for his endurance. She whispered to each that the honor of the nation rested on their shoulders. 20 men were chosen. They were sent out on separate trails with a single command. Do not return until the Crow killer is dead. None of them would ever come home. It is perhaps a mercy that John Johnston never chronicled the specifics of how he dismantled the 20 chosen Crow warriors, one by one. During the years he hunted the first 17, he operated in deep isolation, away from the prying eyes of his peers. Only in the killing of 2 did fellow mountain men bear witness. Undoubtedly, a full accounting of all 20 deaths would serve as a masterclass in Johnston's lethal trade, demonstrating his ability to anticipate his enemy's mind and counter every desperate move. Yet to recount each duel would reduce a saga to a butcher's ledger. The refrain would become nauseatingly repetitive, the snapping of the scalp, the carving beneath the ribs, the consumption of the raw liver. By leaving the details in the dark, liver-eating Johnson allowed the legend to grow in the imaginations of his contemporaries and those who followed. He offered only one concrete detail regarding the fate of the 20. Every single one was killed in hand-to-hand combat. In their final breath, staring into the face of their destroyer, each warrior knew exactly who had come for him. They died knowing they had fallen to the Crow killer, the 18th warrior. Accounts suggest that liver-eating Johnson was genuinely surprised by the reverence he began to receive across the high country. While he remained a solitary figure by nature, he wasn't entirely antisocial. He began to drift into trapper camps, to swap news of the fur trade, and tribal movements. However, he reserved the dark details of his personal war for a tiny family. Of peers, Bear Claw, Chris Lapp, Bigfoot Davis, and especially Del Guay. Even with Del, Johnston shared only what he chose. Yet, through Del's observations, we see a Johnston who had settled comfortably into his dual role as a mountain man and a force of nature. He sought no quarrels outside his specific feud. In his code, vengeance was a private affair. He would help a friend in need, outfitting them or fighting beside them, but he expected them to leave his own wars alone. In the spring of 1855, Johnston met Del Guay at Fort Pierre. It was an act of friendship. Del had been captured by the Sioux the previous year and had escaped with his life, but lost his entire catch. To help his partner recover financially, Johnston purchased supplies for both of them to trap in the Wind River Mountains. Their route took them past the camp on the Musselshell. It had been 9 years since the tragedy of the Morgan family, and while Crazy Woman had many guardians among the mountain fraternity, Del was surprised by how diligently Johnston had maintained his watch over the widow. As they rode away from the cabin, Del pulled up short. "Something is strange here," he muttered. They were facing the 4 graves. At the head of each stood a post, and atop each post grinned a skull. "Those skulls," Del said, pointing. "They're shiny, they're new." Johnston chuckled darky. "Skulls don't last forever. We put up fresh ones regular." Del asked who we might be, but Johnston deflected the question with a tall tale about old John Hatcher returning from the dead. Before Del could press him, Johnston urged him on. "Getting late. You know what that means." Del knew. As dusk fell, the widow's shrieks began to echo through the valley. If the Blackfeet heard that, Del whispered, they'd drop dead from fright. After a week of travel, they found Bear Claw Chris Lapp, camped on the Big Horn. The old man was nursing serious wounds from a grizzly that hadn't been quite as dead as he thought when he approached it. "Bear get you?" Johnston asked. "Great Jehoshaphat, no," Bear Claw roared, shaking the beast's severed claws in Johnston's face. Despite his injuries, he insisted on hosting them. "No liver tonight," he joked grimly, "just fresh venison." 7 days after leaving Bear Claw, Del found the ashes of an Indian fire where none should have been. Johnston dismissed it casually. "Blackfeet," he said. They rode on and made camp that night at Owl Creek, near an old cabin ruin. Del watched his partner closely. Johnston seemed unconcerned, letting their campfire burn bright against the darkness, illuminating them as perfect targets. Finally, Del's nerves snapped. "You said those ashes were Blackfoot. Since when can't you tell Blackfoot from Crow?" Johnston grinned, tapped out his pipe, and stood up from his log. "Figured I could fool you into thinking you didn't know," he said, "but I reckon you did. Kick out the fire, Del." Del scattered the embers instantly, plunging the camp into shadow. He grabbed his rifle and stepped into the brush, straining his ears. For minutes, there was only the sound of horses chewing grass. Then came a muffled curse, Johnston's voice, followed by a grunt and the sickening thud of a heavy blow striking flesh. Suddenly, a massive Crow warrior sailed into the dim glow of the dying coals, landing hard on his hands and knees. The warrior scrambled up, tomahawk raised, but he was facing a demon. Johnston moved with terrifying speed. Before the Indian could strike, Johnston launched one of his signature kicks, catching the man in the groin. The tomahawk clattered to the ground. Johnston stepped in, and with a movement almost too slow and deliberate to be combat, buried his bowie knife in the crow's chest. "Light the fire again, Del," Johnston said calmly. Del rebuilt the fire, protesting that there might be others. Johnston sat back down on his log and refilled his pipe. "This one," he said, gesturing with the stem of his pipe, "is number 18. Just 2 of them left." That night, Del received a lecture on the finer points of Johnston's technique. Johnston explained the strategy of the kick. It wasn't just for damage, it kicked them into position, forcing the body to straighten up perfectly to receive the knife. Then Johnson stood and walked to the corpse. He grasped the scalp lock and demonstrated his scalping method. He pointed out that he didn't use his foot for leverage against the head, as Hatcher had taught them. That was a crude method for beginners. "That old coon never had the practice I've had," Johnson bragged. With a flick of his wrist, the scalp came free. "How many red skins do you reckon you've taken?" Dell asked, watching with morbid fascination. "Wah," Johnson grunted, "not counting a few poor diggers? Maybe 400, 500? He tossed the fresh scalp to Dell. Then Johnson bent over the body again, knife in hand. "Don't, liver eater," Dell pleaded, turning away. "Don't do that. I'm going to gag." "Gag then," Johnson said. With a precise sweep of the blade, he opened the abdomen and reached inside. Captive of the Blackfeet. In the early autumn of 1861, the Crow Killer helped Delguay establish a winter camp east of the Continental Divide, in the rugged country approaching the North Platte in Wyoming. As usual, the plan was to split up and pool their furs later. Dell set up in a lean-to recommended by Bigfoot Davis, while Johnston prepared for a trading run to his Flathead in-laws in the Bitterroot Mountains. For this trip, Johnston carried a cargo that was highly unusual for him, and by his own standards, a mistake. He had acquired 2 20-gallon kegs of whiskey from a Missouri trader. While he despised the sale of rifles to Indians, he was not above trading spirits, despite the volatility it caused. Delguay protested, arguing that 40 gallons of liquid was a dangerous burden for a pack animal. Johnston laughed him off. He loaded the kegs into a custom canvas sling on a powerful sorrel stallion and, mounting his own big black horse, bid Dell farewell with a jeer about his lack of faith in mountain horses. He began the 500-mile trek west. Alone on the trail, Johnston was his usual vigilant self. He knew the path was perilous, crossing the Sweetwater, the Green Mountains, and the treacherous Owl Creek Range, a graveyard for settlers and trappers alike. He relied on his legendary instincts to protect his life and his valuable liquid cargo. But this time, his instincts failed him. He was threading a narrow trail when 2 arrows hissed past his head. He hadn't smelled the enemy. The warriors were entrenched behind rocks, leaving him no target. Realizing he was boxed in and that raising his rifle meant certain death, Johnston dropped his weapon and raised his hands. For the wolf, the young Blackfoot chief who leaped from the rocks, capturing the Crow Killer alive, was a coup beyond measure. His warriors swarmed the trail, and the wolf danced in triumph. "The killer of crows is taken at last," the chief declared in perfect English. "Everything happens eventually," Johnston replied calmly. The wolf tapped one of the kegs. "Whiskey, where are you taking this?" "To my friends, the Flatheads. Let me go," and Johnston realized too late he had blundered. He assumed his knowledge of tribal rivalries would save him, but he had miscalculated. The wolf's eyes lit up with malice. "The Flatheads are women," he sneered. "We will not trade with them. We will trade you to the crows. They will pay a high price for their killer." At the wolf's command, the warriors stripped Johnston of his weapons and his crow hunting shirt. Naked from the waist up, his hands bound, he was forced to march to the Blackfoot camp while being beaten with the flat side of tomahawks. There he was shoved into a teepee and tied securely. Johnston sat in the dark, furious with himself. A Crow chief would have killed him instantly or set him free out of respect. But the wolf intended to humiliate him and sell him like cattle. Methodically, Johnston assessed his chances. By a stroke of luck and Blackfoot negligence, his hands were tied in front of him. He was guarded by a single, inexperienced youth. Outside, the noise level was rising. The Blackfeet had broken into the whiskey. "Come dark," Johnston muttered to himself, "and this old coon will be hard to handle." The young guard watched Johnston with a mix of fear and hunger. He fingered his knife, clearly dreaming of being the one to take the scalp of the famous liver eater. But he feared the wolf more. Whenever the guard stared too long, Johnston stared back with such ferocity that the youth was forced to look away. In those moments, Johnston gnawed at the rawhide thongs binding his wrists. Late in the afternoon, an old woman brought in a bowl of greasy soup, likely dog or muskrat. Johnston didn't complain. He ate it ravenously to build his strength. He then feigned sleep, hunching over his knees. As he hoped, the guard grew bored and looked toward the flap of the lodge, distracted by the drunken revelry outside. Johnston chewed harder. Finally, the old woman returned with a cup of whiskey for the guard. As the youth raised the cup to his lips, Johnston snapped the weakened thongs. The Indian turned to sneer at his prisoner, tapping his knife hilt, then lifted the cup again. Johnston moved with the explosive power of a coiled spring. He launched a kick that lifted the guard off the ground, likely crippling him instantly. As the youth spun, reaching for his knife, Johnston delivered a crushing blow between the eyes. The guard collapsed with barely a sound, the whiskey splashing against the teepee wall. Johnston knew he had only moments. The old woman might return, the guard might be changed. He grabbed the youth's knife and quickly took his scalp, tying it to his belt. Then, in a moment of grim, pragmatic calculation, he did the unthinkable. He needed food for the escape. He slit the buckskin of the unconscious guard's leg, cut down to the bone, and with a terrible twist, snapped the leg free at the hip. It was done with surgical brutality. The victim lived, but was maimed forever. Johnston stepped into the shadows of the night. With the bleeding leg thrown over his naked shoulder, he slipped away from the camp, leaving behind a drunken band of warriors and a guard too stunned to scream. The weather turned vicious. The leg Johnston carried froze solid in the bitter cold. He was hundreds of miles from help. The Flatheads were too far ahead, so he had to backtrack 200 miles to Delgue's camp. For 3 days, he covered his tracks, crawling through snow that turned from a gentle sift to a blinding blizzard. He navigated the washes and canyons, fighting the wind that threatened to flay his exposed skin. He survived by gnawing on the frozen leg. At night, he huddled in rocky crevices, thawing small strips of the meat by small fires when he dared to light them. He broke his knife hacking at the frozen limb and threw the pieces away, forced to use his teeth. One night in the Great Divide Basin, he found a cave that offered rare warmth. He fell into an exhausted sleep, clutching his gruesome provision. He woke to a tugging sensation. Silhouetted in the cave mouth was a mountain lion, dragging the leg away. Roaring with rage, Johnston leaped up, wrestled his food back from the cat, and chased it into the snow. He returned to sleep, only to be woken again by a low growl. A gaunt grizzly bear, disturbed from hibernation by the smoke and the commotion, blocked the exit. "I wasn't in any good humor myself," he later told Dell. Using the frozen leg as a war club, Johnston attacked the grizzly. He smashed the rock-hard limb against the bear's sensitive nose, dodging claws and delivering blows until the confused and battered animal turned tail and retreated into the depths of the cave. Johnston grabbed his prize and abandoned the shelter, walking back out into the storm. Back at the camp, Delgue was sitting by a roaring fire, mending a moccasin and chuckling to himself about Johnston's foolish whiskey run. The wind howled outside, rattling the door latch. Dell stood to secure it, but the door burst open. The winter gale swirled into the room, and with it stood a nightmare. A giant, naked to the waist, skin stretched tight over bones, stood in the doorway. His beard was matted with ice. He dropped a frozen, gnawed human leg onto the floor with a heavy thud. "How are you fixed for meat, Dell?" the apparition rasped. It was liver-eating Johnson, home from the dead. Mountain Man Rendezvous. When spring finally thawed the passes, it was Delgue who took the season's furs down to Fort Laramie. It was also Dell who spilled the story of Johnston's harrowing escape from the Blackfeet. Johnston likely wanted the matter kept quiet, perhaps out of pride, or perhaps he was simply too weak to argue, but once Dell shared the tale with Bigfoot Davis over a jug of trade whiskey, silence was impossible. Bigfoot Davis activated the moccasin telegraph. News that the Crow killer had been humiliated, bound, beaten, and forced to eat human flesh to survive enraged the Brotherhood of the Mountains. A call went out. It wasn't a request, it was a summons. The rendezvous was set for a secluded valley 5 miles east of Virginia City, Montana. 40 of the hardest men in the Rockies answered the call. These were men who lived by the rifle and the knife, men who had survived decades of wilderness warfare. Some had ridden with Sublette, others had traded with Manuel Lisa. They gathered now a cavalry of the damned, heavily armed and itching for blood. Among them was Anton Sepulveda, the giant of the Spanish Peaks. Standing 6'4", with a beard as black as a raven's wing, he rode a coal-black mare with a coat like silk. He was dressed in Comanche leathers, overlaid with intricate Navajo beadwork. Beside him rode Apache Joe Milardo, his constant shadow. Together, they were a two-man army known for decimating Apache war parties. Mariano Modeno rode in from the Big Thompson, a sleek, deadly man on a dainty roan gelding. Modeno usually hunted alone, his white teeth flashing in a grin that signaled violence rather than mirth. There was Grizzly Bill Miller, a Missourian on a Nez Perce pony, who favored his knife over his Hawken rifle and collected bear claws with the same obsession as Chris Lapp. Senor, Wyatt arrived, a man who treated killing with a casual laugh and had earned his name chasing Latin women and fighting off their vengeful kin. The roster of vengeance included Wind River Jake, whose back was scarred by so many Sioux arrows he was said to look like a porcupine; Bald Head Pete, scalped as a boy but now the owner of enough Pawnee hair to thatch a roof; and the terrifying duo of Mad Mose and Hatchet Jack Ireland. Mad Mose claimed to have no memory of life before his family was massacred, a trauma that left him with a penchant for cutting off the ears of his captives. Hatchet Jack preferred dismemberment. Each man carried his own tragedy and his own private war, but they united now for a common purpose: to punish the Blackfeet for insulting liver-eating Johnson. They waited in the valley, a powder keg needing only a spark. Johnson was in Virginia City, conferring with John X. Baedler, the feared chief of the vigilantes. Baedler had intelligence on the location of the Wolf's band. Though Baedler had his hands full with local outlaws, the mountain men were growing restless. Grizzly Bill and Big Anton were threatening to ride into town and tear it apart if Johnson didn't show up soon. Just as their patience broke, Johnson appeared at the head of the valley. The man who rode toward them bore no trace of the starving skeleton who had stumbled into Delgue's cabin months before. He had regained his bulk, his massive frame, filling out his crow buckskins. He rode a racing black horse and was armed to the teeth, not with his old weapons, but with a brace of new Remington .44 revolvers and a butcher knife the size of a machete. He wasted no time with speeches. "They are on Willow Creek by the Three Forks," he announced. It was 50 miles north. The 40 men mounted up, a synchronized movement of leather and steel. With a collective war whoop that echoed off the canyon walls, they spurred their horses. They rode hard for 3 days. On the third night, they crested a hill overlooking the enemy position. They drew straws for the dangerous task of scouting the camp. The short straws went to Mariano Modeno and Lobo Ned, a half-breed tracker from the Gila River country. The two men stripped off their excess gear, keeping only their knives, and vanished into the darkness. The rest of the company waited, honing blades and checking percussion caps. Modeno returned first, 2 fresh scalps dripping in his hand. "How many?" Johnson asked. 70 minus 2, Modeno whispered. The camp was wide open. Lobo Ned returned silently as the men mounted up. He had found the bodies of the sentries Modeno killed. The path was clear. There was no need for delay. The horses' hooves were muffled with rawhide. Modeno took the lead, guiding the column until they were 300 yards from the sleeping village. Johnson looked at his army. Senor Wyatt rolled a cigarette. Big Anton twisted his mustache. Mad Mose gripped his hatchet, eyes wide with anticipation. Johnson slapped the flank of his black pony. The charge hit the Blackfoot camp like a landslide. The roar of 40 heavy-caliber rifles shattered the night, followed instantly by the screams of the dying. The mountain men swept through the village, firing, trampling, and slashing. Within 10 minutes, the trappers were piling wood onto the campfires to illuminate the carnage. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. By the time the sun rose, 69 Blackfoot scalps lay in a pile. The trappers, miraculously unscathed save for a few scrapes, cleaned their knives and ate provisions taken from the dead. But Johnston was missing. Hours passed. The men smoked and waited. Finally, just before full daylight, the Crow killer emerged from the brush. He carried a gruesome burden under one arm, the severed head of the wolf. On his belt hung the chief's scalp. Over his shoulder, he carried his reclaimed property, the rosewood-handled Walker Colt and the massive Bowie knife. "It is finished," Apache Joe murmured to Big Anton. "It is 70. Big Anton gestured to a nearby clump of trees. Apache Joe understood instantly. He rode over, cut a slim box elder sapling, and trimmed it into a sharp stake. Several men broke the ground with their knives. Johnston drove the stake into the earth. With grim finality, he impaled the head of the wolf on the point. His companions packed dirt around the base to hold it steady. As the morning shadows stretched across the bloody creek bottom, the ritual was complete. The mountain men mounted up, their bloodlust sated. Johnston looked at the pile of scalps that belonged to him, while Delguay began to collect them. Johnston turned to the men who had ridden hundreds of miles to avenge his honor. "I am obliged," he said simply. "If you ever need help, send word." The men grunted their acknowledgments. There were no long goodbyes. They were solitary creatures returning to their solitude. They rode off in ones and twos. Big Anton and Apache Joe were the last to leave. "There are no more to kill," Johnston told them. "A pity," Big Anton replied. "You have him," Joe said, looking at the grisly totem on the stake. They turned their horses and shouted back a final salute. "Ventura!" Johnston had taken his vengeance on the wolf. But the debt was not just paid in blood, it was stamped into the earth. When his allies called on him in the future to fight the Sioux or the Nez Perce, he would answer. He had shown them his proficiency with a knife and a skull. Now, they would expect nothing less, and the legend would only grow darker. Boots and biscuits. According to Delguay, liver-eating Johnston paused his private war to join the national one simply because the Civil War looked like the best fight available. In 1864, with the Indian front momentarily quiet, Johnston shelved his feud with the Crows, specifically the 20th Warrior, who had been hunting him for 12 years, and looked east. On February 24, 1864, the 41-year-old trapper and a group of younger mountain men enlisted in the Union Army in St. Louis. Assigned to Company H of the 2nd Colorado Cavalry, Johnston found military life restrictive. While allowed to keep his sidearms, he was forced to trade his beloved Hawken for a Spencer repeating rifle. Johnston despised the Spencer. He distrusted the mechanism, fearing the magazine in the stock would explode. In his first skirmish, he reportedly threw the modern weapon away and picked up a dead man's single-shot musket. Johnston's military career was short and violent. Designated as a sharpshooter due to his uncanny aim, he fought in the battles of Newtonia, Missouri. However, the liver-eater's habits did not mesh well with military regulations. During the fighting, he harvested a significant number of scalps from Confederate Seminole and Union Cherokee troops alike. To Johnston, an Indian in a fight was an enemy, regardless of the uniform. The Union officers disagreed. After a sharp reprimand for mutilating friendlies, Johnston surrendered his trophies and began to long for the lawless freedom of the Rockies. He was honorably discharged in September 1865. He wasted no time shedding the trappings of civilization. At a Pawnee camp on the Platte River, Johnston struck a trade with a chief named Bear That Walks on 2 feet. He gladly handed over his blue uniform, cap, and, most importantly, his heavy cavalry boots. In exchange, he received a blazed-face black stallion, buckskins, a beaver cap, and moccasins. As he pulled the soft leather over his feet, replacing the rigid army boots, he grunted in pure ecstasy. He was a mountain man once more. The Pawnees warned him that the Sioux and Cheyenne were painting for war along the Oregon Trail. Johnston, rearmed with his Hawken and his matched Colt and Bowie, felt prepared. His journey back to the mountains was marked by a brief, brutal encounter with 4 Cheyenne warriors. They ambushed him near Delgue's camp, but when Johnston charged them rather than fleeing, the lead warrior took a bullet in the neck. The other 3, perhaps recognizing the demon charging them, fled in terror. Johnston rode into Delgue's camp on the Little Medicine Bow with news of the war. But Del had grimmer news from the mountains. The fraternity of the trapline was dying. Apache Joe was gone. Bigfoot Davis had fallen to the snakes. Senor Wyatt had been riddled with bullets in the San Juans, his head mounted on a pole. Del also warned that the Blackfeet had placed a bounty on white scalps. Any warrior who took one would be made a chief. Despite the ominous news, Johnston's return to the wild was surprisingly peaceful. He refused to believe the Blackfeet could succeed where the Crows had failed. He and Del trapped through the winter with great success. Their only hostile visitor was the 20th Crow, the last of the designated executioners. The end of the long vendetta was almost comically domestic. Johnston was famous in the mountains for his biscuit-making skills. One afternoon in early March, he spent the day baking a large batch to last them through the end of the season. As the last pan browned, he walked to the river to scrub his utensils. As he scoured a pan with sand, his nose twitched. He smelled a familiar, rancid scent. Johnston didn't turn. He hunched low and crept through the grass until he could peer back at the camp. There, squatting by the fire, was a massive Crow warrior. The brave was stuffing hot biscuits into his mouth with one hand while clutching a naked knife in the other, his eyes scanning the horizon for the enemy he expected to be miles away. Johnston crept along the riverbank, utilizing the stealth that had kept him alive for decades. He could have shot the man from a distance, but the Crow killer had a sense of poetic justice. He wanted this last enemy to know exactly who killed him. The warrior reached for another biscuit. Suddenly, a tremendous force struck him from behind. Johnston's kick launched the man into the air. The Crow twisted like a cat, landing on his feet with his knife ready, but he was already singing his death song. He had barely hit the ground when Johnston's bowie buried itself in his chest. When Delgue returned to camp that evening, he found a dead Crow warrior lying by the fire and a fresh batch of biscuits keeping warm near the body. "Nothing for me, liver eater," Del said quickly, eyeing the corpse. "I killed some sage hens downriver. I'm not hungry." "Sage hens, my foot," Johnston growled. He insisted on recounting the details of the kill while eating his supper, biscuits that had been sitting inches from the dead man's blood. "Good God," Del muttered, staring at the body. "That is number 20. "On my trail for 14 years, Johnston said. The 2 men fell silent, contemplating the sheer tenacity of their enemy. They spoke with a strange respect for the dead man. For 14 years, this warrior had lived in the wilderness, away from his family, hunting a ghost. He had surely watched his own children grow from a distance, driven by a duty that had now led him to a lonely death over a pan of biscuits. "I'm sure glad that's over," Del said, poking the slit in the dead man's abdomen with a stick. Johnston didn't mock his partner's squeamishness this time. Quietly, he carved the 20th notch into the rosewood handle of his knife. Del tried to lighten the mood. "The doctor at the fort says liver gives a man strength." "Never hurt nobody," Johnston agreed. He looked at the pan by the fire. "I'll be baking biscuits again tomorrow." Portuguese Phillips. By 1866, the West was engulfed in one of the greatest concentrations of hostile Indian power in history. The conflict would rage into the 1870s, dragging even a reluctant, liver-eating Johnston into the fray. While he eventually joined the military campaigns, Johnston clung to the mountain man's creed. Armies were fine for protecting settlers, but when a garrison was surrounded and facing slaughter, it took a solitary man of the wilderness to break the siege. Johnston's respect for individual heroism was profound, and his role in the Ride of Portuguese Phillips demonstrates this. He aided the scout in his darkest hour, yet stepped back into the shadows so the glory would belong to Phillips alone. The Sioux, led by the brilliant strategist Red Cloud, had united with the Cheyennes, and Arapahoes. They were determined to halt the white encroachment on the Bozeman Trail. Every wagon train was a target. Every settlement lived in fear. On July 15, 1866, Colonel H.B. Carrington led the 18th U.S. Infantry to a plateau between the Little and Big Piney Creeks in Wyoming to construct Fort Phil Kearny. It was a provocative move, built in the heart of Red Cloud's territory. From the moment the first log was laid, the Sioux watched. They harassed the builders constantly. When the fort was finally abandoned years later, the warriors burned it to the ground before the dust of the departing soldiers had settled. But in the winter of 1866, the fort was a prison. 250 people were trapped inside, facing not only the Sioux, but one of the harshest winters in Wyoming history. To keep the fires burning, woodcutters had to venture out, making them easy prey. Red Cloud used them as bait. When a wood train was attacked, Colonel Carrington sent the brash Captain William J. Fetterman to relieve them, with strict orders not to pursue the Indians past Lodgepole Ridge. Fetterman, who had famously boasted that with 80 men he could ride through the whole Sioux nation, disobeyed. He led 80 men over the ridge and into a trap. 1,000 warriors rose from the grass. The massacre was total. No soldier survived. The bodies were crushed and mutilated in a display of absolute dominance. Carrington was left with a skeleton crew, terrified civilians, and a fort on the brink of annihilation. He knew he could not order a man to ride for help. The nearest reinforcements were at Fort Laramie, 236 miles away. The country between was swarming with victorious Sioux, and the temperature had plummeted to 25 degrees below zero. To send a soldier was a death sentence. But a civilian scout named John Portuguese Phillips stepped forward. Phillips was a giant of a man, heavily bearded and intimately familiar with the terrain and the tribes. He made a simple request: "I want the best horse on the post and a sack of biscuits." Carrington gave him his own horse, a Kentucky thoroughbred Arabian, widely considered the finest animal on the frontier. The colonel knew he was sacrificing the horse to save his command. As Phillips prepared to leave, Carrington issued a grim final order to his officers. If the walls were breached, they were to blow up the magazine where the women and children were hiding. There would be no captives. As night fell, the blizzard paused just long enough for Phillips to slip out the gate. The sentry watched the scout merge with the darkness, riding into a frozen hell. Phillips shunned the Bozeman Trail, knowing the Sioux would be watching it. He rode parallel to the road, miles out in the deep drifts. The snow began to fall again, blinding him, caking the horse's face in ice. He navigated by instinct, pushing the thoroughbred to the edge of its endurance. The cold was a physical weight, numbing his mind and body. By midnight, he reached the shelter of a cliff near Crazy Woman's Fork. He rested briefly, feeding the horse grain and melting snow for water, but he dared not sleep. He pressed on. Around 4 a.m., he reached the deserted Fort Reno. He allowed himself and the horse a 2-hour rest before riding back into the gray dawn. The second day offered slightly better weather, but the distance was crushing. Phillips kept the horse at a gallop where the ground allowed, eating up the miles. By nightfall, he was approaching the overland trail near Fort Casper. Exhausted, freezing, and hallucinating from fatigue, he spotted a clump of willows near a creek. He heard voices. Expecting Sioux, Phillips drew his revolver and rode straight into the brush, deciding to die fighting rather than freeze in the saddle. He found a roaring fire, the smell of coffee, and 2 rifle barrels pointed at his chest. "Where are you from, Portuguese?" asked a familiar voice. It was Liver-Eating Johnson, camped with the vigilante leader, ex-Beadler. Phillips was so frozen he couldn't answer. Johnson lifted him gently from the saddle, prying his stiff fingers from his rifle. He poured coffee and fed the scout antelope steaks. "You're going to sleep now," Johnson commanded. Phillips protested. He couldn't afford the time. "I'll wake you," Johnson promised. "We just came from Laramie. I know the shortcuts. I'll make up the time." Phillips slept like the dead. 2 hours before dawn, Johnson woke him. The thoroughbred and Johnson's big black stallion were saddled and ready. "I'll show Portuguese the rough parts," Johnson told Badler. "Watch your scalp." The two men rode into the teeth of a gale. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero. Johnson's beard became a solid block of ice, but the wind was at their backs, and Johnson led them on a furious pace, cutting miles off the journey with his intimate knowledge of the land. They stopped briefly in a dry wash at noon. Johnson built a small fire to thaw them out. He studied the colonel's thoroughbred. The horse was trembling, its reserves nearly gone. "This horse is about done," Johnson observed. "I think we'll make it," Phillips said, his voice raspy. "You can," Johnson said, "but take it easy." "Aren't you coming in with me?" Johnson shook his head. He had escorted Phillips through the worst of the maze, but he would go no further. "Plenty of men might want to, but not this coon," he said, knocking ice from his beard. "You see, Portuguese, this ride is going to make history. It belongs to you." They shook hands. Phillips turned toward Laramie, still miles away, and Johnson turned back into the storm, fading into the whiteout. On Christmas Eve, Fort Laramie was festive. Officers and their wives were dancing in Bedlam, the main quarters, oblivious to the tragedy to the north. Outside, the blizzard howled. The sentry at the gate heard a sound over the wind. He opened the heavy doors to reveal a ghost, a horse and rider encrusted in ice, moving with agonizing slowness. As they entered the parade ground, the great thoroughbred groaned and collapsed, dying where it fell. Portuguese Phillips staggered from the saddle. He stumbled up the steps of Bedlam, the music spilling out into the night. He pushed open the door, a frozen specter crashing the party. He pointed to his dispatch pocket and collapsed on the floor. The message was delivered. Reinforcements were sent. Fort Phil Kearny was saved. Carrington's dispatch read, "I risk everything but the post and its stores. I risk everything but the post and its stores. I need prompt reinforcements and repeating arms. Give me officers and give me men." While Phillips recovered and the army mobilized, liver-eating Johnson rode back to his Solitude. That same brutal winter claimed another victim of the frontier. Mrs. Morgan, the crazy woman of the Musselshell, went blind from an old injury and starved to death in her cabin, alone with her ghosts. A Sioux liver. Even a man as solitary as liver-eating Johnson could not ignore the defense of women and children. In 1869, at Fort Hawley, he found himself standing between settlers and the wrath of the Sioux. However, his specific contribution to the defense, the eating of a raw Sioux liver, was less an act of hunger than a performance demanded by the very peers who had helped him avenge the Blackfeet years before. Fort Hawley, named for a fur wholesaler who never laid eyes on it, served as a trading post and a hub for the rough men of the Rockies. When Johnson arrived on business, he found the post crowded with refugees, settlers driven from their homesteads by Sioux raiding parties. The sky along the Missouri was dark with the smoke of burning cabins. The mountain men had gathered to offer their guns. Delguay was there, along with his partner from the previous winter, Jim Deere. The vigilante ex-Bidler was present, as was the ancient Bear Claw Chris Lapp. Bear Claw had mostly retired from bloodletting to sell his claw necklaces to riverboat tourists, but the emergency brought him out of the Little Rockies. Hatchet Jack Ireland and his adopted father, Mad Mose, rounded out the group. While the few soldiers stationed at Hawley huddled inside the stockade, Johnson and the trappers camped outside where they had stomping room. They repaired gear, fished in the muddy Missouri, and kept a loose watch. They held the Sioux in such contempt that they often relaxed their guard, confident that one mountain man was worth a company of regulars. Other trappers drifted in, including the renowned Indian fighter George Grinnell, who reported that the area was clear of hostiles. 2 days after this assurance, Johnson and Delguay were fishing from cottonwood stumps on the riverbank when a woman's scream shattered the afternoon calm. Grabbing their rifles, they scrambled up the bank. In the brush, they saw two women who had been picking Juneberries. One was white, the other Indian. The white woman, Jenny Smith, lay on the ground, scalped alive. The Indian woman was fleeing toward the fort, limping from a bullet wound in her hip. Johnson wasted 2 minutes cursing himself for believing Grinnell's report. "I've been smelling those Sioux for an hour," he growled, before launching the pursuit. The Sioux warriors attempted to escape through a belt of willows running parallel to the river, but they had not scouted the terrain well enough. Pressed hard by the trappers, they dropped into a dry wash at the end of the timber. It was a fatal error. The wash was a dead end. They were boxed in. Their only hope was to lure the trappers into the open, but the mountain men knew better. They had the Sioux trapped like rats in a barrel. All they had to do was wait for dusk. Throughout the afternoon, the Sioux taunted their pursuers, raising their coup sticks above the rim of the wash. The mountain men used the sticks for target practice, shooting them in two. As twilight fell, Johnson and Delguay crawled on their bellies through the scrub brush. They discovered the Sioux had fortified their position with heavy shields made of bull buffalo neckhide and hung blankets to obscure their silhouettes. Against the old-fashioned Hawken rifles, these shields might have held. But the mountain men were armed with the new terror of the plains, the .56 caliber Springfield needle gun. These rifles fired a massive lead slug with a firing pin inches long, backed by a heavy powder charge. They punched through buffalo hide as if it were paper. Dell crawled back to the main group to report. The trappers lined up at the mouth of the wash. It wasn't a battle, it was a firing squad. The first volley killed a third of the trapped warriors. Realizing their shields were useless and death was inevitable, the survivors began their death songs. One by one, they climbed the rim of the wash to meet the bullets. One warrior, his hips shattered, lay on the ground singing until Jim Deere approached. Him. Deere's pistol misfired on all cylinders and he reached for a rock to finish the job, but Johnson stepped in and ended the song with a bullet. There was little celebration among the trappers, aside from the routine collection of scalps. But Hatchet Jack, ever the provocateur, decided to test the legend. "Ever chew on a Sioux liver eater?" he asked loudly. The other mountain men gathered around. Johnson's reputation was on the line. He could not back down. Without a word, he stooped over the warrior he had just killed. Within moments, he held the dripping organ in his hands. Delguay turned away, unable to watch. Holding the trophy high for the audience, Johnson sank his teeth into the raw flesh. "I can see how you earned your name," George Grinnell remarked. "Great Jehoshaphat, Pocahontas, and John Smith," old Bear Claw roared. "He was eating them way back in Hatcher's time?" Johnson spat out a piece of gristle. "Dell doesn't like it," he said dryly. "Makes him gag." He did not finish the meal. He tossed the liver aside and turned his attention to the boiling of 32 skulls. Days later, the steamer Huntsville docked at Fort Hawley, and its passengers were greeted by a nightmare. Peter Koch recorded the scene in his journal. A row of stakes planted along the riverbank, each topped with a grinning white Indian skull. Guarding this gruesome gallery was liver-eating Johnson. He leaned on a crutch, nursing a bandaged leg. In the heat, he wore only a shrunken red undershirt that barely reached his hips. His matted hair and bushy beard fluttered in the breeze, a wild, demonic figure that shocked the eastern sensibilities of the travelers. Years later, various storytellers would invent tall tales about how Johnson earned his name, stories involving tenderfoots in the 1880s and fake liver-rubbing pranks. But the truth was found in the mud of the Missouri in 1869. Johnson ate the liver because the code of his brethren demanded it. Before consuming that Sioux liver, however, the Crow Killer had made peace with his oldest enemies, and soon he would find himself fighting alongside the Crows as a brother in arms against the rising tide of the Sioux. Monument for a Foe's Friend. In the winter of 1868 to 69, liver-eating Johnson and the vigilante ex-Beidler found themselves free of military obligations and low on funds. they decided to partner up for a trapping season. Avoiding the crowded fur fields, they holed up in Beidler's comfortable cabin in the Big Belt Mountains. Despite their grim reputations, the two men enjoyed each other's quiet company and worked hard, emerging in March with 2 pack horses groaning under the weight of prime pelts. Their journey out of the belts was a return to the basics of mountain life: simple, dangerous, and free. As the snowmelt swelled the rivers, they rode along the banks, vigilant as always. The spring thaw brought movement not just to the water, but to the tribes. Small bands of Crows and Blackfeet were on the move, looking for trade or trouble. It was a war party of 20 young Blackfoot warriors who found the trappers' trail. Spotting the heavy packs of furs, they smelled easy wealth and glory. But like so many before them, they failed to realize who they were tracking. Johnson had caught their scent a full day before they made their move. Beidler remarked, "If those red devils knew who they were trailing, they'd be making tracks the other way." Instead of fleeing, the 2 mountain men selected a killing ground. They chose the forks near the headwaters of the Musselshell, west of Pompey's Pillar. It was a perfect stage for a trap. As dusk fell on a moonless night, they built a massive fire using green brush and driftwood. The smoke and flames signaled their presence for miles, a beacon no raiding party could ignore. They tethered their horses safely in the darkness, well away from the light. Then, they backtracked and positioned themselves on opposite sides of the trail hidden in the rocks and brush. Armed with new Spencer repeaters and braces of revolvers, they waited. Hours passed. The fire burned down to a bed of glowing coals. Johnson heard them first, though to an untrained ear the night was silent. Beidler heard his partner's low warning from across the trail. "Here they come, X." Beidler watched down the trail. Finally, he saw shapes flitting from rock to rock. The Blackfeet were skilled, moving with ghost-like stealth, but they were walking into a crossfire. The leader, emboldened by the silence of the camp, stepped into the firelight. Beidler could see the reflection of the embers in the warrior's eyes. The leader raised a hand, signaling his men forward. Suddenly, the clearing was filled with 20 warriors, clustering together to receive orders for the attack. The trap snapped shut. Rifles erupted from both sides of the darkness. Caught in the open, silhouetted against the fire, the Blackfeet were cut down before they could locate their enemies. Johnson and Beidler emptied their repeaters and drew their revolvers, closing in to finish the work. One warrior managed to slash Beidler's shoulder with a knife before dying, but the rest were overwhelmed by the sudden, devastating violence. Within minutes, 17 Blackfeet lay dead. Only 3 escaped into the night, 2 of them badly wounded. Johnson and Beidler wasted no time. They took the scalps and the rifles, Johnson noting grimly that traders were arming even the young bucks with modern weapons, and rode for the river. They crossed the stream multiple times to hide their trail before stopping to dress Beidler's wound with herbs from Johnson's saddlebag. They spent the daylight hours hiding in one of Johnson's old concealed cabins. On the second night of travel, they entered a belt of heavy timber. Beidler followed Johnson single file, recognizing the terrain. "By God," he whispered, "this is the trail to the crazy woman's place." Johnson said nothing but kept riding. They emerged into a clearing beside a derelict cabin. Johnson led the way past the structure to the 4 mounds where Mrs. Morgan had buried her family. The graves were weathered and neglected, the skull-topped poles long since fallen. But Johnson walked past them to a 5th grave, set apart. It was a magnificent cairn of stones, standing 8 feet high. "You knew she was dead?" Beidler asked. "I knew," Johnson replied. He explained that she had starved to death during the harsh winter. He walked around the cairn. 4 new poles had been erected around this grave, mirroring the ones the widow had tended for so long. Atop each pole sat a cracked, grinning skull. "Crows piled up these stones," Johnson said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Why not the Blackfeet?" Beidler asked. It was their territory. Blackfeet hated her. They were scared to come here. But why the crows? Beidler pressed. You've been killing them for 20 years. Johnson took a chew of tobacco. Indians are funny creatures, Beidler understood as he watched his friend. The Crows, the sworn enemies of liver-eating Johnson, had built this monument to the white woman he had protected. It was a gesture of profound respect, not just for the mad woman touched by the spirits, but for the deadly enemy who had been her guardian. In the spring of 1869, the partners arrived at Johnson's woodyard on the Missouri. The stacks of cordwood stood untouched. The rivermen respected the woodhawks, and the Indians feared the owner too much to burn it. Johnson reached into a knothole in a gnarled cottonwood, his wilderness bank, and pulled out a roll of bills left by the steamboat captains. While they camped there, the steamer Nile docked to take on wood. Captain Grant Marsh invited the two famous frontiersmen aboard to celebrate his birthday. The treat was ice cream, made with ice stored from the winter. Johnson, terrified of looking like a greenhorn in front of the civilized passengers, whispered to Beidler, "X, where in hell does this stuff come from?" Beidler, equally ignorant but quick-witted, hissed back, "Shut up, fool, it comes in cans." They gulped the frozen mixture down, hiding their frozen teeth. Beidler got his revenge on the curious passengers later. When a lady asked if he was married, Beidler replied solemnly, "To an indigenous woman, ma'am." "Where is she now?" the lady asked. "I sent her to Rome." "Rome, Italy? How wonderful!" "No, ma'am," Beidler deadpanned, "to Rome on the prairie." While Beidler enjoyed the social hour, Johnson sat by the campfire at night, combing scalps and staring into the flames. He had business to finish. When Beidler left for Fort Hawley to sell their furs, Johnson saddled his horse immediately. He rode west. He knew a band of Crows was camped between the Musselshell and the Judith River. These were likely the same warriors who had built the cairn for the crazy woman. Johnson carried a peace, offering a 5-gallon keg of whiskey. Though he later thought better of giving liquor to young braves and cached it along the trail, his intent was clear. After a quarter-century of blood, the Crow killer was ready to bury the hatchet. He knew the Crows were brave and honorable warriors. The time for feuding was over. He was riding to make peace. Target for Gray Bear. Chief Gray Bear of the Crows, accompanied by 26 seasoned warriors, had pitched camp where the Judith River spills into the Missouri, east of Fort Benton. They were far from their home lodges, returning from a trapping expedition on the Milk River near the Canadian border. Trapped by spring floods, they were waiting for the waters to recede before pushing on to Hawley's trading post to sell their peltries. Johnson could have waited to meet them at the fort, but he chose a different path. A crowded trading post, filled with white merchants and soldiers, was no place to settle a blood feud. If the long war between the Liver Eater and the Crow Nation was to end, it had to happen in the wild, alone, where forbearance would be a choice, not a necessity enforced by guns. For days the Crows waited. The delay wasn't just due to the river. The territory was crawling with Blackfeet. Although the Crows were not afraid of a fight, Gray Bear knew that engaging one Blackfoot hunting party might draw down a swarm of others like hornets. They had not worked through a brutal winter just to hand their furs over to their enemies. It was a relief when, late in April, scouts reported that the Blackfoot bands were moving south toward the Yellowstone. "We go," Gray Bear commanded. Teepees were struck, packs were lashed tight. As the clouds broke and the sun finally warmed the earth, the sentries were called in. With the camp bustling with preparation, Gray Bear walked 50 yards to a secluded pocket of scrub trees to drink from a cold spring. He knelt, scooping water to his mouth with cupped hands, washing away the dust of the long wait. He slapped his wet hands against his buckskin leggings and stood up. Instantly, the hair on his neck rose. He heard the scrape of an iron-shod hoof on rock. Gray Bear spun around. A horse had stepped quietly through the brush. The rider sat motionless, looking down at him. "Do you know me, Indian?" asked liver-eating Johnson. Gray Bear stared. He looked as if he were seeing a spirit rise from the earth. As Johnson later recounted to White Eye Anderson, it was the only time he had ever seen a warrior turn pale. Johnson held his hands out, palms open, the universal sign of peace. Gray Bear's hand had flown to the tomahawk at his belt, but seeing the gesture, he let the weapon slide back. He relaxed his grip, though the fear and hatred of 20 years did not vanish so easily. "You are the White Hunter," Gray Bear said, his voice steady but tense. "You are the one who took the trail against us. You are the Liver Eater." "Right on the first guess," Johnson replied, "but I've come to end it." Gray Bear stood silent, waiting for the trick. "Crazy Woman has a monument," Johnson explained. "She was buried by crows." Gray Bear nodded. He told Johnson that White Badger and his braves had built the cairn for the old woman. "Crow warriors," Johnson mused. "Crow warriors," Gray Bear affirmed. "To honor a white woman touched by the Great Spirit, and to show our scorn for the Blackfeet." The tension in the air broke. The shared respect for the mad widow had bridged a river of blood. Gray Bear, warming to the situation, invited his ancient enemy to join his band for a hunt on Big Dry Creek. Johnson shook his head. "Too many young bucks with you," he said with a wry grin. "It was young bucks that sent me on your trail in the first place." With that, the Crow killer slapped his horse's flank and rode through the brush. He turned his broad back to the chief, the ultimate sign of trust. He rode away not as a hunter, but as a friend. Brother of the Crows, the White Chief. Gray Bear kept his word. He spread the news through the high country. The hatchet was buried. The Liver Eater was no longer the scourge of the Absaroka, but their friend. The news was met with skepticism. Grizzled mountain men, cynical from years of betrayal, decided to wait and see before trusting this new alliance. Traders suspected a trick. But the Sioux, ancient enemies of the Crows, saw an opportunity to mock. Black Elk, a Sioux chief on the Rosebud, sneered at the reports. "The livers of the Crows are diseased," he proclaimed to his warriors. "Eating them has made Dapiek Absaroka as cowardly as the Crows themselves." He challenged Johnson to try the organs of a Sioux or Cheyenne if he wished to regain his strength. When Johnson heard the taunt at Fort Hawley, he chuckled. "You can tell old Black Elk I might get around to his liver next," he told a friendly Cheyenne. Then, saddling his horse, he rode toward the Bitterroots to visit his Flathead kin. Meanwhile, a storm was gathering in the south. Big Anton Sepulveda, the giant Spaniard, was riding north to find Johnson. Beside him rode a new partner, Pancho Robles, cousin to the late Apache Joe. Robles was a deadly addition to the fraternity. A former vaquero, he carried a weapon more terrifying in his hands than a pistol. A 75-foot riata of braided horsehair, thin as a snake, and just as lethal. The pair stopped in a village beneath the Sangre de Cristo peaks, where local youths were throwing knives at a target. Anton and Robles watched for a moment before putting on a display that silenced the crowd. Anton hurled his massive 16-inch Bowie knife into the bullseye from horseback. Before a local could retrieve it, Robles flicked his wrist, and the silk-thin loop of his riata snagged the knife handle, snapping it back into Anton's hand. They repeated the feat a dozen times before riding on. Anton was gathering a legion. Along the way, he picked up the hardest men in the mountains. Arkansas, Pete Arnold, who nearly shot Anton for sneaking up on him, Hatchet Jack Ireland, Mad Mose, Mariano Modeno, Wild Ben, and the ancient bear claw Chris Lapp. They reunited at the La Salle Mountains, a legendary meeting of the frontier's elite. While the 9 trappers rode north to find Johnson, they were intercepted by a lone rider near the Blackfoot River. It was a Shoshone warrior, the son of the chief Wani, whom Hatcher had saved years before. He brought desperate news. The Nez Perce, specifically the Salmon Eaters, were slaughtering Shoshone women and children. Wani had been killed. The warrior hadn't just come for help, he had come for his chief. Years earlier, in gratitude for his services, the Shoshone Council had voted John Johnston a chief of their nation. It was a title Johnson rarely spoke of, but he was honor-bound to answer the call. "I guess I can't pass this up," Hatchet Jack mused. "Liver Eater is a chief. He has to fight." The small band of trappers swelled into an army. They recruited 20 trappers from the Wintas and a dozen more trading with the Flatheads. Johnson accepted the command. He now led a force of nearly 40 mountain men. But the Indians rallied too. 28 Shoshone braves joined the column to avenge their dead chief. 50 Flatheads volunteered. And in a historic twist, the Crow chief Big Antelope offered 30 of his best warriors to fight beside their former nemesis. Johnson looked over his force of 160 men. "Guess I've got an army," he grunted. The campaign began with a trek into the rugged country of the Salmon River. Johnson accepted the help of 3 Ute trackers to scout the path, though he trusted them about as far as he could throw a buffalo. He assigned the eagle-eyed Mariano Modeno and Arkansas Pete to watch the scouts day and night. For days, the Utes led them deeper into Nez Perce territory. Mariano, who seemingly never slept, honed his knife on the top of his boots and watched the guides with dark suspicion. On the 8th day, the head Ute scout returned, claiming the main Nez Perce village lay exposed and unaware on the east side of the Weiser River. He urged the column to take a shortcut through a wide canyon. Johnson rode to the front. He let the column advance, but as they neared the canyon mouth, he pulled up short. He sniffed the breeze drifting from the shadows. "It's a trap," Johnson roared, wheeling his horse behind a boulder. The warning came a second too late. The canyon walls erupted with gunfire. The Nez Perce were not fighting with bows and arrows. They were armed with Spencer repeating rifles. Chaos consumed the vanguard. A Flathead warrior and 3 Shoshone died instantly. Mad Mose took a bullet through the chest, but Johnson's warning had saved the main body. The mountain men dived for cover in the rocks, their return fire witheringly accurate. When the Nez Perce cavalry thundered out of the canyon to finish the slaughter, they were met by a wall of lead. In the melee, Big Anton Sepulveda stood tall, firing his revolvers. A Nez Perce sniper rose from behind a rock and fired. The giant Spaniard crumpled. Pancho Robles saw his friend fall. Dropping his guns, he uncoiled the riata. The loop hissed through the smoke and settled over the sniper's neck. Robles snubbed the rope to his saddle horn and spurred his horse. The Indian was jerked from cover, dragged across the sharp rocks until the thin cord sliced through flesh and bone. The head separated from the body. Robles didn't retrieve it. He sent the grisly trophy rolling toward Johnson. Johnson, out of ammunition and facing a charging warrior, caught the severed head and hurled it like a stone. It struck the mounted Nez Perce, knocking him from his horse. Johnson finished him with his bowie. The battle turned. The combined firepower of the trappers and their Indian allies broke the Nez Perce charge. As the enemy fled, the victors secured the field. When the smoke cleared, Johnson called for the Ute scouts. Mariano Modeno and Arkansas Pete marched the leader forward. The traitor's face was bloody. Pete had been slapping him with fresh scalps. "Traitor," Johnson growled. He waved the others back. "You and I are going to hug." He stood unarmed. "Throw him your knife, Mariano." Mariano tossed his blade to the Ute. The scout, seeing a chance to kill the white chief, caught the weapon and lunged. Johnson didn't move until the blade was inches away. He kicked the Ute's wrist, sending the knife flying, then smashed a fist between the man's eyes. The Ute scrambled up and grabbed the knife again, slashing upward. Johnson sidestepped and delivered a kick that lifted the scout 2 feet into the air. The Ute landed hard, his neck broken. Johnson scalped him, then handed the knife back to Mariano to slit the traitor's throat. "One more for Mad Mose," Johnson said. He walked to where Hatchet Jack sat, holding the dying. Mad Mose. The old man was coughing blood, his hand still gripping his hatchet. "We chased many a red nigger off this earth," Jack wept. "He was like a father to me." Johnson looked down at his friend. The bald patch on Moses' head, where he had been scalped decades ago, was pale against the gore. "Tell Jack who he was," Delguay urged softly. Johnson sighed. "He was John Morgan," he said, "the husband of the crazy woman." The mountain men fell silent. They had known Mose only as a mad killer of Indians, a man without a past. Johnson had kept the secret for years, allowing the broken man his anonymity. They buried Big Anton and Mad Mose on the battlefield. 63 Nez Perce warriors lay dead nearby. A young trapper asked if they should bury the enemy. Mariano Modeno pointed to the sky, where the vultures were already circling. "No need," he said coldly. "I was too hasty. I should have let the birds eat them while they were still alive." Biscuits for Blackfeet. In the summer of 1871, Fort McPherson, Nebraska, became the staging ground for a grand assembly of the frontier's restless spirits. Mountain men, soldiers, wolfers, and Indians gathered to trade lies and plan their next moves. Liver-eating Johnson arrived on the big black horse that had once belonged to Big Anton, looking to put together a small elite crew for a trapping expedition into the Bighorn Mountains. The gathering attracted all kinds, including the flamboyant William Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody, a showman at heart, was eager to join the legendary Crow Killer. While the East would later idolize Cody as the quintessential frontiersman, the hard-bitten men of the West held a different view. They considered him a poor shot and a better actor than a fighter. White-eyed Jack Anderson, a young trapper looking for a place in the mountains, witnessed the interaction. Delguay, perhaps joking or perhaps testing his partner, suggested they take Cody along. Johnson spat a stream of tobacco juice. "He'd just get his fancy britches dirty in the big horns," he grunted. Cody was left behind to recruit actors for his stage plays. Johnson selected his team carefully: Delguay, the veteran Pete Coyle, and the newcomer White-Eye Anderson. They rode first to Fort Pierre on the Missouri to collect Coyle's gear, then turned their horses west toward the shining peaks of Wyoming. The journey was a masterclass for young Anderson. As they crossed the plains, listening to the creak of leather and the thud of hooves, the older men swapped stories that would freeze the blood of a city dweller. Anderson contributed his own tale of survival, how he had once hidden from a Sioux war party by submerging himself in a muddy buffalo wallow while a prairie fire raged overhead, burning his eyebrow white and earning him his nickname. They passed through the Black Hills without incident, though Delguay remained pessimistic. "Wherever Liver Eater goes, trouble follows," he warned Anderson. Pete Coyle countered that he'd once seen Johnson go a whole season without killing an Indian, but the tension was palpable. When pressed, Johnson only offered a cryptic warning: "If there are any tenderfoots scared of Indians, they best stay out of the Big Horns." Anderson's unease deepened when they reached their destination. Johnson led them to a cabin perched 50 feet above a canyon floor, built directly over a spring. It was a perfect defensive position, with one fatal flaw: it was a box canyon. There was only one way in and one way out. "This is a trap," Anderson told his partners. "I told the Liver Eater the same thing," Del admitted, slapping the young man on the back. "Suppose the Indians have already spotted us?" "Then we'll have to climb the walls," Pete Coyle joked, gesturing to the sheer cliffs rising 1,500 feet straight up. Despite the tactical nightmare, the trapping was magnificent. The canyon was a fur pocket teeming with mink and beaver. For a month, they worked the streams, piling up a fortune in pelts. At night, they sat by the fire, skinning the catch while Johnson sat in the dark corner, smoking his pipe and offering gruff corrections to their tall tales. Then came the snow. One overcast night, Johnson abruptly stood up and walked out into the dark with his rifle. He returned an hour later, snow dusting his massive shoulders. He leaned the rifle in the corner and sat back down. "Horses and mules are gone," he said calmly, relighting his pipe. Delguay threw a half-skinned pelt onto the dirt floor. "I told you, Pete. I told you this meant Indians." Johnson chuckled softly. "What do we do now?" Anderson asked, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "We're shut in. No way out. We've lost the horses, the furs, everything." Del opened the door. A gust of wind blew snow into the room. "There'll be 3 feet of that by morning." Johnson stood up, the firelight catching the red of his beard. He looked like a Viking king contemplating a massacre. "Del," he said, "I lost more than any of you, didn't I?" "Yes," Del admitted. "You lost the best horse in the West." "Don't fret, youngster," Johnson said to Anderson. "We'll get out of here, and we won't be followed." "Blackfeet?" Del asked. Johnson nodded. "Biggest biscuit eaters in the world." To the astonishment of his partners, Johnson began to stoke the fire until it roared. "To fool those Blackfeet," he explained. Then he took 2 large bread pans from the wall and dumped in a mound of flour. He reached for a tin can on the shelf, poured half its contents into the flour, and began to mix it. "What is he doing?" Anderson whispered to Del. "Making biscuits," Del replied, though he looked confused. "Liver Eater makes the best biscuits in the mountains. Guess he thinks the Blackfeet are going to be hungry." Anderson tried to joke. "I've had his cooking. I'd say he uses too much baking powder." Johnson turned slowly, fixing Anderson with his terrifying gray eyes. "This ain't baking powder." Pete Coyle let out a loud guffaw. "That's Wolfer's strychnine, son. Baking powder is for white men. This recipe is special for Blackfeet." "There's going to be some split livers around here," Del grinned. Johnson placed the pans near the fire. The dough rose and browned, filling the small cabin with a deceptively homey aroma. Shortly after midnight, Johnson moved to the rear of the cabin. He unbarred a heavy door that Anderson had assumed led to a storage cache cut into the rock. "Built this cabin for just such a time," Johnson murmured. He stepped inside and was gone for 30 minutes. When he returned, he was smiling. "Storm's cleared. Stars are shining. Time to shake out through the tunnel." "You dug a tunnel?" Del asked, amazed. "Natural fissure," Johnson corrected. "Leads to the next canyon over, just a little 10-foot drop." The trappers prepared to leave. They knew the trek to Laramie would be brutal, 250 miles on foot in the snow. But Johnson had one final touch to add to his trap. He dumped the rest of the strychnine into the flour sack and threw the empty can out the front door. He arranged the pans of hot golden biscuits prominently by the fire. "They look natural," he said with satisfaction. "They'll think we ran off just as we were sitting down to eat." He ushered his partners into the tunnel and barred the door from the outside, sealing the cabin. Johnson never went back to check his trap. He didn't need to. But the grim epilogue was provided years later by old Jim Baker, a survivor of the Hugh Glass era. "I was with Arapaho Joe and the Bighorns that next spring," Baker told White-Eye Anderson. "We went up that canyon just as the snow was melting. We flushed the buzzards off the skeletons of 29 Indians." "Could you tell the tribe?" Anderson asked. "Sure," old Jim snapped. "They were Blackfeet. They were lying all along the canyon wall, clawing at the rock like they were trying to climb. Out of the belly of hell." A last departure. After the strychnine-laced escapade in the Bighorns, Delguay had his fill of excitement. He told his partner he wanted a season of hunting and fishing, preferably in a place where Indians were scarce and peace was plentiful. Johnson, understanding the old man's weariness, suggested they return to the beginning, the cabin on the Little Snake River, the place old Hatcher had bequeathed to him nearly 30 years prior. They arrived in the autumn of 1872. The cabin, neglected for years, needed work. They rebuilt the corral, chinked the logs, and stockpiled a mountain of firewood and horse feed. True to his word, Del initially focused on hunting to fill the larder, while Johnson laid out his trap line. But the habit of a lifetime is hard to break. Within a week, Del grew bored of fishing and insisted on coming in on the deal. Despite the change in plans, The winter passed in rare tranquility. They trapped until the deep snows locked them in, then spent the long frozen months sitting by the fire, two old wolves resting in their den. When the spring thaw finally broke the ice on the river and turned the grass green, the partners decided to move on. They planned to visit Mariano Modeno at his stronghold on the Big Thompson. On a crisp, clear morning in May, they began to pack. Dell watched with growing confusion as Johnson stripped the cabin bare. Usually, a mountain man left a shelter intact, perhaps leaving behind a little firewood or salt for the next wanderer who might need refuge. But Johnson removed every scrap of utility. Then, he did something shocking. He piled dry fodder and brush against the interior walls. "I'll never need this roost no more," the crow killer announced. He struck a match and tossed it into the kindling. This was not an act of vandalism. It was a funeral rite. He had left cabins standing all over the Rockies, but this one was different. This was the home where he had left the swan. This was the place where his life had shattered. He would not leave it for another man to inhabit. A brisk north wind caught the flame, and soon Hatcher's old roost was roaring, the fire consuming the memories of a ghost. With 3 loaded pack horses in tow, the partners mounted and rode down the valley. Johnson held the lead lines, his face unreadable. After a few miles, he veered off the trail, leading Dell into a rocky cluster near the canyon wall. They stopped before a massive, square-cornered cairn of stones. The dirt packed between the rocks had settled and hardened over the decades, proving it had stood undisturbed for a generation. It was the tomb of the swan and her unborn child. Johnson sat on his horse, spitting tobacco juice into his beard, staring at the grave. As they watched, the sun crested the canyon rim. A single beam of light struck the center of the cairn. There, basking in the sudden warmth, lay a massive rattlesnake, fresh from hibernation. The reptile sensed the vibration of the horses. It coiled instantly, its tail blurring into a warning whir, its flat head weaving, tongue tasting the air. Delgue's reaction was instinctive. He snapped his rifle to his shoulder, lining up the sights on the snake's head. But a heavy hand struck the barrel, knocking the aim wide. "Leave the critter be, Dell," Johnson rumbled. A strange, grim smile touched his lips. "It'll make a good watchdog for me." He turned his horse back to the main trail. Dell followed, but before they rounded the bend that would hide the valley forever, he looked back. Smoke billowed from the burning cabin, drifting down the canyon like a dark spirit. Delgue was a rough man, uneducated and hardened by a violent life, but in that moment he felt the weight of history shifting. It felt as if a wind was blowing down from the Wind River Mountains, sweeping away the last traces of the old frontier. Liver-eating Johnson had buried his dead, set his watchdog, and burned his bridges. He rode on, leaving the ashes of his youth behind. Mariano and the Ute Chief. Mariano Modeno was a man of contradictions. Small in stature but tough as cured leather, he was a product of Taos, carrying the blood of Spain and the indigenous tribes in his veins. Yet, despite his heritage, he harbored a hatred for Indians that bordered on the pathological. He was an educated man, claiming fluency in 13 languages and literacy in 5, alongside a mastery of a dozen tribal dialects. He had cut his teeth in the fur trade alongside giants like Sublette, Hugh Glass, and Bill Williams. In the hierarchy of the mountains, he bowed to no man, save for liver-eating Johnson, whom he revered. Sometimes, however, Mariano's cruelty tested even the stomach of a man like Delgue. His final reckoning with Captain Jack, the outlaw Ute Chief, serves as the grim proof. Like Johnson, Mariano had taken a Flathead wife. Though his courtship was purely transactional, he bought her from a French trapper, who had stolen her in a raid. He renamed the woman John. As John, she rode the trap lines beside him for years, proving herself as lethal as any man. Eventually, Mariano settled down, after a fashion, in the Big Thompson Valley of Colorado. He built John a large log house and a fortified trading post he named Namaqua. The valley was a paradise, and Mariano monetized it shrewdly. He built a toll bridge at a key ford on the Emigrant Trail, turning his fort into a stage station on the overland route. He hired friends to run the business, but left the true command to John, his Indian wife. Mariano himself refused to be domesticated. To him, a home was merely a depot for reloading ammunition. He cultivated a reputation for invincibility, claiming he was too dangerous to hit. In reality, his body was a lead mine. General A.H. Jones once recounted asking Mariano about a strange lump beneath his skin. With a grin, Mariano allowed the general to squeeze it, popping out a flattened, heavy-caliber bullet. "That is a Arapaho lead I've carried for 20 years, Mariano laughed. "It's been working its way out lately." By the time Johnson and Del Guay arrived to visit, Mariano was a wealthy man. Emigrants passing through marveled at his vegetable gardens, his milk cows, and his thriving poultry yard. But the master of the estate looked like a beggar. The partners found him sitting on his porch in a rocking chair, surrounded by piles of tack. His black hair hung in his eyes, and he wore frayed trousers that had seen better decades. He was meticulously rubbing a dark object with a smooth stone. "Polishing harness," Johnson whispered to Del. They rode up to the porch steps before Mariano acknowledged them. Standing up, the legendary Indian fighter revealed his handiwork. It wasn't leather harness he was polishing, it was a fresh Ute scalp. Later accounts would romanticize the feud between Mariano and the Ute Chief, known as Captain Jack, suggesting they gentlemanly divided the territory between them. The truth was far uglier. Jack was a renegade who had promised to burn Mariano at the stake. Mariano, in turn, had promised Jack the limb. It was a war of extermination. 50 scalps on the walls of Namaqua testified to Mariano's success in whittling down Jack's band. Invigorated by Johnson's arrival, Mariano immediately proposed a hunting trip. The quarry was Captain Jack and his remaining outlaws. Del Guay, tired of bloodshed, would have preferred to fish, but Johnson, refreshed by sleeping indoors, was eager for the trail. They hunted the Utes across northern Colorado for weeks. It was a frustrating game of cat and mouse. In 3 separate ambushes, Johnson managed to kill and scalp 2 of Jack's braves, but the wily chief slipped away each time. Finally, as summer waned, Mariano decided to finish it alone. He made his friends promise to wait for him at the fort and rode out solo. Days turned into weeks. Johnson grew restless, anxious to return to the northern trap lines, but he would not break his word. Finally, after 3 weeks of silence, Johnson told Del they would wait one more day. If Mariano didn't return, they would go looking for his body. "Maybe the Ute finally got him," Del suggested. "No Indian alive could salt away the Spaniard," Johnson replied with conviction. "But he might have broken a leg." The final day passed slowly. At sunset, the dogs in the yard began to bark. Johnson grabbed his rifle and ran to the road, joined by the station's hangers-on. Through the twilight haze, they saw a lone rider approaching on a tired horse. "Is that you, Mariano?" Johnson called, thumbing the hammer of his rifle. "Yes, it is I, Senor Liver Eater," came the weary reply. As he rode closer, they saw he was carrying a chief's full regalia across his saddlebow. In his hand, he held a dripping scalp, high for them to see. "This was Captain Jack," Mariano announced. The next morning, Johnson and Del Guay packed their gear to leave. Mariano had given them a pack horse loaded with supplies as a parting gift. As they rode down the valley of the Big Thompson, the sun was just cresting the peaks. "Mariano told us he took that scalp 4 days ago," Johnson mused, "but it looked fresh, didn't look an hour old." "Agreed," Del said. Johnson suddenly pulled on his reins, stopping his horse. He pointed to the ground. A pile of autumn leaves lay in the middle of the trail, splattered with fresh, bright blood. "Reckon Mariano killed him here?" Dell asked. "Jack ain't dead yet," Johnston said grimly. "Look up, lad." Dell craned his neck. Towering above them was a massive, gaunt cottonwood tree, its branches swaying in the cold wind. High up, a heavy limb had been pulled down under tension. Dangling from that limb was an Indian. He was not hanged by the neck. He was suspended by plaited rawhide ropes passed under his arms and knotted behind his back. He swung in the breeze, his body twitching with exhaustion and agony. He was scalped, but he was alive. His black eyes, filled with undying hate, locked onto the trappers below. He made no sound. Delgué stared in horror. "I reckon I'll kill the critter," he said, raising his rifle to end the torture. Johnston struck the barrel down with savage force. "Do you think he would have spared Mariano?" Johnston snapped. He looked up at the swinging man one last time. "How are you feeling, Red Coon?" he shouted. "Is it cold up there?" As they rode away, leaving the chief to the wind and the coming winter, Johnston explained the technique to a shaken Dell. "That was old Milt Sublet's trick," he said. "You lasso a high limb, snub the rope around the trunk, and let your horse pull it down. Then you tie up your man and turn it loose. It snaps back up. Almost as shivery as watching you eat liver," Dell muttered. The Pagan Princess. By the mid-1870s, the frontier was aflame. The government had opened the Black Hills, the sacred Pahasapa of the Sioux, to gold seekers, sparking a conflict that would define the era. These were the bloody years of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, culminating in the summer of 1876 when the Sioux seemed invincible. Liver-eating Johnston was in the thick of it. In 1875, he guided Captain V.T. McGillicuddy's topographical engineers through the hills, reportedly saving the party from annihilation multiple times. By 1876, he was serving as the chief of scouts for General Nelson A. Miles, leading a band of Crow warriors against their mutual enemies. Yet, despite his official capacity, the most enduring story from this period involves Johnston riding not with an army, but with a single, starving woman, White-Eye Anderson, who was in the territory that year with the likes of Wild Bill Hickok and Calamity Jane, recounted the tale. According to Anderson, the 53-year-old Johnston showed no signs of aging. There wasn't a gray hair in his beard, and his massive frame still filled his buckskins. He was armed with a .45 Colt Army revolver and an improved Spencer repeater, claiming the needle gun could hit an enemy as far as he could smell one. He rode a black stallion gifted by the Crows and sat in the silver-mounted saddle of the late Big Anton Sepulveda. It was on the headwaters of the Rosebud Creek that he found her. She was a Pagan, a tribe Johnston considered poor relations to the Blackfeet. She was huddled in a brush lean-to made of twigs, starving and wizened, looking more like a crone of 70 than a young woman. She had no knife, surviving by catching minnows in the creek with a reed snare. She recognized Johnston instantly. To the tribes of the North, his silhouette was unmistakable. Johnston communicated in sign language, deducing that the Cheyennes had cast her out to die. He fed her from his saddlebags, then rearranged his packs to give her a mount. As they rode, he noted that despite her emaciated state, she sat a horse with the grace of a warrior. They traveled down the Rosebud, a land still trembling from General Crook's recent defeat by Crazy Horse. Johnston was cautious. That night, 35 miles from the Yellowstone, he made a cold camp. The country was crawling with hostiles, celebrating their victories. He divided his jerky and pemmican with the woman and gave her his blankets. He spent the night with his back against a boulder, rifle across his knees, watching the dark. At dawn, after the danger of a night attack had passed, he allowed a small fire for coffee. The woman gestured for a knife. Johnston handed her his heavy bowie. She cut a sapling and fashioned a crude club. Seeing her attempt to arm herself, Johnston reached into his bags and pulled out a legendary weapon, the throwing knife of Big Anton Sepulveda. She took the blade, tested its balance, and slid it into the scabbard at her waist, discarding the club. She mounted her horse, and they set out. Johnson, usually so vigilant, later admitted he credited the woman with saving his life that morning. The trail wound through thick brush and rocks. To keep the woman in sight, Johnson slapped his horse to speed up. At that precise moment, an arrow hissed through the space he had just occupied. His horse reared in panic, throwing the giant trapper to the hard earth. Through the dust, Johnson saw a young Blackfoot warrior charging him with a club. Before Johnson could recover his breath or draw a weapon, a tattered figure flew past him. The pagan woman launched herself at the attacker. Big Anton's blade flashed in the morning light. She drove the knife into the Blackfoot's chest, again and again, screaming in fury. By the time Johnson scrambled to his feet, the warrior was dead. Johnson stood over the body, stunned. For the first time, someone else had fought his battle. "Him alone brave," the woman said in clear, broken English. "No more come. Horse and timber." "I didn't know you could talk white, girl," Johnson said, staring at her. She wiped the bloody knife on a patch of moss and handed it back to him. Then she pointed to the dead warrior's scalp. Johnson shook his head. "I don't like using toothpicks for this job," he grunted, drawing his own bowie. He took the scalp with a single slash and handed it to her. It was her kill. They retrieved the horses and the dead warrior's gear. The woman, who Johnson named Waving Grass, donned the dead man's buckskin jacket and weapons. That night, Johnson authorized a fire. He ate, smoked his pipe, and for the first time in years, slept soundly on the trail without one eye open. Waving Grass took the watch. She sat with the heavy needle gun across her lap and a revolver at her hand, her eyes fixed on the darkness until dawn. Waving Grass remained with Johnson for 2 winters. They scouted for the army and trapped in the Belt Mountains. She was an equal partner, doing her share of the work and watching his back in a country where every shadow held a threat. Over the campfires, Johnson learned her history. She was the daughter of a chief, and she had learned English as a child from a captured white woman in her father's lodge. Her life had been a series of violent abductions. Captured by the Sioux during the Minnesota uprisings, she had witnessed the slaughter of hundreds. Later, she was taken by a Cheyenne warrior named Screeching Cat. When Screeching Cat's first wife murdered him in a jealous rage, Waving Grass was blamed and cast out onto the prairie to starve. She might have stayed with Johnson longer, but the frontier was changing and Johnson was set in his ways. After a profitable winter, they sold their furs on the Yellowstone. Johnson divided the proceeds straight down the middle. He bought her 2 horses, packed them with supplies, and armed her with a new rifle and revolver. He sent her to the Knife River Compound, a gathering place for the widows and orphans of the Indian Wars. She rode away proudly, known now as Johnson's Indigenous Woman. Later, a cavalryman named Jacob Homer visited the compound and made a crude remark to a group of Indian women. He was shocked when one of them turned and dressed him down in perfect, scathing English. She told us, Homer later recounted, that she was the wife of liver-eating Johnson, and we believed her. 8 scalps for the Crows. When Johnson arrived at the mouth of the Rosebud, intending to rendezvous on the Musselshell, he found his destination had come to him. The camp was already teeming with the men he expected to meet. Yellowstone Kelly, the renowned chief of scouts for General Nelson Miles, had just arrived from the Tongue River with intelligence that the Sioux were massing for a final stand. Delguay was there, along with the veteran frontiersman Jim Moorman. 25 Crow scouts, led by their chief Black Eagle, had established a base of operations, stockpiling meat and readying pack horses for war. But the camp held a tension that had nothing to do with the Sioux. Ais, deserter, had ridden in 3 days prior, a massive black cowboy named Grant. He had come up the Bozeman Trail with a cattle herd intended for the Army, but decided he preferred the life of a free agent. Grant carried a dark reputation. He was the gunman who had famously crippled the Texas cowboy Charlie Siringo with a treacherous shot to the knee, a deed rumored to be a paid hit. Grant had forced his company upon the scouts. When Kelly told him he wasn't needed, Grant simply grinned, fingered his guns, and claimed he was an expert Indian killer. In reality, he terrorized the Crows, bullying them in their own camp. By the time Johnson arrived, Jim Mormon reported that the Crows were holding a council to decide whether to tie the intruder up and burn him alive. Johnson sat on the ground among the scouts, sharing a pipe with Black Eagle, while Mormon explained the situation. He watched Waving Grass broil antelope steaks over the fire, his expression impassive. "Burning is too cruel," Johnson rumbled. "Where is this man?" "Over in the timber," Mormon pointed, "camped by the spring. He told the Crows he might get angry and poison the water." "He'll never poison your water," Johnson promised, "unless his carcass floats in it." He finished his steak slowly, savoring every bite. The Crows watched him with glittering eyes, sensing that the Dapiak Absaroka was about to hold court. Johnson walked toward the trees. Grant was sitting in a clearing, mending his saddlebags, oblivious to the giant approaching him. He was a powerfully built man, dressed in denim and flannel, with 2 revolvers and a large Bowie knife at his waist. He was humming a tune until a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Johnson standing there. Behind the trees, Crow faces painted for war peered out silently. "Those Indians won't hurt you," Johnson said calmly. "They are here to watch me move you down the road." Grant scrambled to his feet, sizing up the intruder. He saw the hard, gray eyes of the mountain man and looked away, unnerved. "Reckon you don't know who I am, white man," Grant sneered. Laughter erupted from the trees. Delguay and Jim Mormon stepped into the clearing. "Reckon it's the other way around," Mormon called out. "Reckon you don't know, Johnson?" Grant's hand hovered over his pistol grip. Johnson stood with his thumbs hooked casually in his belt. "To hell with who you are," he said. "I'm offering you your life. Get on your horse and get out." Grant made his move. He drew his right-hand pistol with blinding speed, but he was too close. As the gun cleared leather, Johnson stepped aside. Grant's bullet tore harmlessly into the dirt. In the same motion, Johnson's right hand clamped onto Grant's wrist like a bear trap. With his left hand, Johnson grabbed the gunman by the back of the neck. Using his immense leverage, he threw his entire weight against Grant's extended arm. There was a sickening snap as the elbow shattered. Grant roared in pain and reached for his second gun with his left hand. Johnson didn't give him the chance. He swept Grant's legs out from under him, throwing him 10 feet across the clearing. As Grant tried to rise, Johnson drew the stone tomahawk given to him by the Crow Chief White Badger. He hurled the weapon. It turned once in the air and struck Grant squarely between the eyes. The renegade collapsed, dead, before he hit the ground. Jim Mormon retrieved the tomahawk from the skull. Waving Grass took the weapon and washed the blood from it in the spring. Johnson turned to Black Eagle. "You can have his scalp," Johnson said, "and his horse and guns." The confrontation with Grant was a mere prelude. Most of the Crow Scouts moved on to Big Dry Creek to coordinate with the Army, but Black Eagle and 7 warriors remained with Johnson, Mormon, and Delguay to hunt. On a moonless night, while Delguay stood guard, a low moan drifted from the darkness. Del crawled toward the sound and found a white woman dragging herself along the ground near a dry gully. She was delirious and covered in blood. She had been scalped alive. Johnson was the first to reach them when Del raised the alarm. While Waving Grass dressed the woman's terrible wounds, Johnson pieced together her story. She was the sole survivor of 3 families massacred at the Great Bend of the Musselshell 5 days earlier. 7 Sioux warriors had taken her captive, scalped her, and left her for dead. 7 Sioux, Johnson mused, and she crawled 2 miles. They carried the woman to safety and saddled up immediately. The moon had set, but the stars gave enough light to ride. Johnson sent the Crow Scouts ahead to cut for sign. Black Eagle returned an hour later, ghosting out of the gloom. The scout known as the Owl handed Johnson a charred stick and a leaf heavy with coagulated blood. "Which direction?" Johnson asked. The Owl pointed west. "You see," Johnson told his partners, "they are backtracking. They know she survived. Long enough to talk." "So they are circling back to ambush the rescue party?" Del asked. "Something like that," Johnson said. "Lead on, Owl." They rode through the night and the next day, stopping only to rest the horses. They spotted a massive Sioux village on the move, 500 warriors joining Crazy Horse, but Johnson ignored them. He was hunting 7 specific men. At dawn on the second day, the owl returned from the point. The white woman knew how to count, the scout reported. 5 braves sleep in the only standing cabin. 2 are on watch. The trappers left their horses downriver and crept through the willows. The massacre site was a ruin of burned timber, but 1 cabin remained intact. Behind it lay the bodies of the settlers. Johnson lay prone, resting his heavy .56 caliber buffalo gun on his elbow. He looked at his companions. "I'll take the one walking," he whispered. "Dell, you take the other. Try to hit the ones in the cabin in the legs." "Now, Dell, Johnson said. The heavy boom of the needle guns shattered the morning silence. The sentry, cleaning his rifle, crumpled without a sound. Johnson's target, his skull shattered by the heavy slug, stood upright for a horrifying second before toppling into the sand. The 5 warriors inside the cabin burst into the open, running straight into a wall of lead. 3 were cut down instantly. The crows broke cover, screaming their war cry, and rushed the survivors. 1 wounded Sioux died under the tomahawk before he could finish his death song. The last warrior, his legs shattered by bullets, tried to raise his rifle from the ground. Black Eagle kicked the weapon away and scalped him alive. The surviving Sioux looked up, pain and defiance in his eyes. He saw the white giant standing over him. "Absaroka!" Black Eagle shouted. "Will you help avenge your brothers?" Johnson knew what was asked of him. For decades, the Sioux had mocked the Crows for allowing 1 white man to terrorize them. This was the final answer to those taunts. Slowly, deliberately, Johnson drew his Bowie knife. He knelt over one of the dead warriors. With surgical precision, he made the incision and pulled out the liver. The Crow warriors stood tall, watching. The surviving Sioux watched, his eyes wide with horror. Johnson held the dripping organ high. He brought it to his mouth and bit into the raw flesh. Then, grimacing with disgust, he spat the piece directly into the face of the wounded Sioux. "That there ain't fit for a dog to eat," Johnson growled. He turned his back as the Crows finished their work. The trappers buried the white settlers and burned the last cabin, creating a pyre for the 6 dead Sioux. As the party rode back toward the Big Porcupine, 7 fresh scalps dangled from the Crow bridles. Black Eagle rode beside the liver eater. "Absaroka," the chief said solemnly. "For this, the Absaroka, thank you." Delgwe watched his partner closely. Johnson stared south toward the valley of the Little Snake where his war had begun 30 years ago. His eyes were cold and unreadable. "The Crows don't owe me nothing," Johnson replied. The Old Trapper, Burial for Bear Claw. Following the winter campaign of 1876 to 77, the spine of the Northern Plains tribes was snapped. General Miles's victory at Wolf Mountain broke the spirit of Crazy Horse, and with the decline of Sioux power, the world John Johnston and his brethren had known began to dissolve. The frontier was closing. Settlers, gold seekers, and vast herds of Texas cattle flooded the open spaces. To the old trappers, these newcomers were pilgrims, soft men invading a hard land. The mountain men were dinosaurs, wandering a world that no longer needed them. In the autumn of 1878, Delgwe and Hatchet Jack found liver-eating Johnson camped at Pryor's Fork on the Yellowstone. The outlook was bleak, furs were scarce, and the old dangers that gave life its savor were fading. Even good steel was hard to find. Jack complained that his new hatchet was fit only for driving nails, not for chopping Indians. Seeking solitude and better hunting, the 3 partners packed their horses and headed north to the Little Rockies, below the Milk River. It was Bear Claw Chris Lapp's country. They promised themselves they would check on the old hermit before spring, but first they had to secure their own winter stake. Delgwe selected a campsite on the southern slope of the range, a spot he had once shared with the legendary trapper, Old Mizzou. As they raised their cabin in mid-October, a light snow began to fall. a traditional omen of a good trapping season. The omen held true. Johnson and Jack brought in heavy hauls of pelts in the first week. Dell took his turn as camp tender, hunting and cooking. Peace reigned until mid-December. One evening, Dell returned from a hunt empty-handed and agitated. He reported that he had cached an elk shoulder in a tree, but while returning, he heard a gunshot in the distance. Likely bear claw, Dell suggested, though he looked unconvinced. "You take the trap line tomorrow, Dell," Johnson said, his eyes narrowing. "That wasn't Chris shooting. He laid up his winter meat months ago. Jack and I will take the trail in the morning." At dawn, under a sky piercingly cold and clear, Johnson and Jack followed Dell's tracks. They found the tree where the elk had been cached. It was stripped bare. Both shoulders and both hams were gone. Johnson knelt in the snow, reading the story written there. "3 red coons on foot, Jack. Blackfeet. They heard Dell shoot but got here after he left. Dell was lucky." Hatchet Jack trembled, not with fear, but with the old bloodlust. "Come on, liver eater." They might have found old Chris. Rifles at the ready, they broke into a trot, their moccasins crunching on the hard-crusted snow. The trail led them inexorably toward Bear Claw's Canyon. As they rounded the final bend, they saw the cabin tucked into its niche in the rock. Wall. The door stood wide open. They ran to the threshold. The interior was undisturbed, the pole bunk, the rough table, the simple tools of a solitary life. But the walls were bare. The famous grizzly claw necklaces were gone. And on the earthen floor lay Bear Claw Chris' lap. His head was a mask of clotted blood. In one stiffened hand, he still clutched a leather thong and a few loose claws. He had been working on a necklace when he died. Johnson inspected the front wall. He found a gap where the chinking had fallen out between the logs, a fatal oversight. The bullet had come from outside, passing through the gap and striking Chris in the head. Johnson walked to the back wall and dug the slug out of the wood with his Bowie knife. "Needle gun," he growled. The heavy caliber told him the Blackfeet were armed with modern buffalo rifles. "Traders," Jack spat, "selling heavy guns to hostiles." "Someday, Jack," Johnson promised, "I'm going to quit hunting Indians and start hunting the traders who arm them." Chris was still warm. He had died that morning. The partners reconstructed the night. The 3 Blackfeet, drawn by Dell's shot, had missed the hunter but stolen his meat. They had stumbled upon Chris's cabin by accident and waited out the night. When Chris lit his lamp or fire in the pre-dawn dark, the light shining through the chink gave them a target. One shot, a kicked-in door, and the legendary Bear Claw was gone. "They took his pretties," Jack said, looking at the bare walls. "They took the best," Johnson agreed. He pointed to the bloody patch on Chris's skull. "Looks like old Mose looked." The sun was just cresting the peaks. They were hours behind, but the snow held the trail. They followed the tracks, noting that the Blackfeet now had horses, Chris's string. Suddenly, Johnson stopped and sniffed the air. "This child smells smoke." They crept to the rim of a canyon and looked down. The 3 warriors were having breakfast. They were struggling with a large trunk-like box, trying to lash it onto Chris's skittish pack horse. Johnson and Jack lay on their bellies, sighting down their heavy barrels. "In the shoulder," Jack whispered. Johnson nodded. This was not a moment for a clean kill. The rifles roared. The 2 warriors handling the horse spun around, their shoulders shattered by the heavy slugs. The terrified horse reared and bolted. The heavy box crashed down on the 3rd warrior. Johnson reloaded calmly, sliding a fresh cartridge into the breech. He fired again. All 3 Indians were now down, writhing in the snow. The trappers descended the canyon wall at a leisurely pace. Jack didn't reach for his gun. He drew his hatchet. With one blow, he smashed the lock on the fallen trunk. It burst open, spilling Bear Claw's lifework onto the snow. Dozens of perfectly matched grizzly claw necklaces. "Finished pieces," Johnson noted. Jack put away the hatchet and drew his knife. The Blackfeet, bleeding to death from their shoulder wounds, began to sing their death songs. Jack walked up to the first one. He drove the blade into the warrior's eye socket and flicked the eyeball onto the snow. The warrior grunted but kept singing. "Forgot something," Jack muttered. He drew his hatchet again and scalped them alive, lifting them by their hair and chopping the skin free from the skull. "That's for Mad Mose," he said. Finally, at Johnston's urging, Jack went down the line and decapitated them. They loaded the trunk onto the pack horse and tied the 3 severed heads by their hair to the saddle horn. They rode back to the cabin leading the horses. They carried Chris's body outside. Then they filled the cabin with brush and dry wood and set it ablaze. They sat by the fire for hours, waiting for the intense heat to thaw the frozen ground. When the earth was soft, they dug a grave. They wrapped Bear Claw in his blankets, leaving his face exposed. 35 years I've known this coon," Johnston said, softly. "First met him on the Green River. He used to say, 'Great Jehoshaphat, Pocahontas, and John Smith,'" Jack finished for him. Jack threw armfuls of the claw necklaces into the grave. Then he opened his own pack and dumped out over 100 preserved scalps, Bear Claw's private collection. "Never sold a scalp in his life," Jack said. "Kept them all shined up with his pretties." They filled the grave and piled a cairn of stones over it. Then Jack dug 3 holes at the foot of the grave and planted 3 sharpened box elder stakes. On each stake, he jammed a Blackfoot head. "You know, liver eater," Jack said, stepping back to admire the gruesome sentinels, "Indian heads look better without any eyes." They rode back to their own camp in a blizzard that shook the mountains, but they found warmth waiting. Delgwe had a roaring fire and hot steaks ready. That night, safe from the storm, they swapped stories of the cold. Johnston remembered the ride of Portuguese Phillips to Laramie. Del argued that Johnston's own trek from the Blackfoot camp was the coldest feat in history. They didn't know it then, but another link to the past had snapped. Mariano Modeno, the fierce Spaniard who hated Indians and loved Johnston, had died late that summer. Breaking all mountain man traditions, he had simply taken off his moccasins, lay down on his front porch, and died of old age. Hatchet Jack kept his promise to Bear Claw. Before the season ended, he hunted down the traders who had sold the needle guns to the Blackfeet. He killed them and mounted their heads on poles above Fort Peck. The code of the mountains was harsh, but it was kept to the bitter end. Sheriff Johnson. With Bear Claw Chris Lapp buried and Mariano Modeno gone, the fraternity of the mountains had thinned. Liver-eating Johnston and Delgwe were now old trappers, though Johnston, well into his 60s, possessed the vitality of a man half his age. Following a successful winter in the north, Johnston drifted south, away from his old haunts. He stopped in Leadville, Colorado, a boomtown that had exploded overnight. It was a place where fortunes were made in the dark of a mine and lost in the spin of a roulette wheel. The town was flooded with Welsh miners, Eastern gamblers, and fancy women. Desperados walked the streets openly, rubbing shoulders with speculators in patent leather shoes. To the old mountain men, these newcomers were pilgrims, soft men invading a hard country. White-Eye Anderson and Yankee Judd were there, working as foremen at the Bullseye Mine. Judd had begrudgingly accepted the work, fearing a lonely death in a snowbank, but his heart remained in the high country. One morning in late August, Anderson and Judd were washing up after a shift when a commotion erupted on the street below. They looked out to see a camp of Cheyenne warriors packing up in a hurry. Sensing trouble, they strapped on their gun belts and ran down to the street. They pushed through a crowd of gawking miners and found a tableau that silenced the street. Standing in the center of the road was liver-eating Johnston. At his feet lay 2 unconscious miners, known locally as brawlers and troublemakers. Facing Johnston was Bill Greiner, the sheriff of Eagle County. Standing back, leaning on his rifle with a sardonic grin, was Delgwe. Sheriff Greiner was a mountain of a man, nearly matching Johnston pound for pound. He rarely used his pistol, preferring to crush resistance with his bare hands. His star gleamed in the sun as he stared Johnston down. "We can't have our citizens knocked around like this, stranger," Griner said, his voice low and dangerous. "Then you'd best keep them off me," Johnston rumbled. "I haven't killed anyone here, yet, but their tender feet stepped on me. I just knocked their heads together to teach them manners." A dozen mountain men in the crowd cheered. "These aren't tenderfoots," Griner corrected. "They are miners." "All town pilgrims are." "Tenderfoots," Johnston countered. "If anyone but a pilgrim shoved me like that, they'd be dead by now." Delguay chuckled. White-Eye Anderson considered stepping in to explain who the giant was, but an unexpected advocate emerged from the Cheyenne camp. Hanging Kettle, the Cheyenne chief, pushed through the crowd. He was dressed in his finest regalia, a tall beaver hat adorned with eagle feathers. "How are you, Hanging Kettle?" Johnston asked casually. The old chief peered up. His eyes widened. "Dapiek Absaroka," he turned to the sheriff. "This is the killer of crows," Hanging Kettle announced, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "He is the white chief of the Shoshone. His enemies' bones are scattered across the mountains. My grandsons were not born when he started his war. He is death-walking." "What does that have to do with me?" Griner asked, unimpressed. The chief drew himself up. "Dapiek Absaroka will kill you with one hand," he said simply. "White lawman, you are only a papoose compared to him." For the first time, doubt flickered in Griner's eyes. He looked from the chief to the red-bearded giant. "So you are liver-eating Johnson," Griner said. "That's me," Johnston agreed. He looked Griner over with genuine appraisal. "You're about the biggest papoose I ever saw. Are we going to hug?" Griner weighed his options. The anger drained from his face. "I don't think we'll hug," he said, extending his hand. "Welcome to Leadville, Johnson." Johnson gripped the sheriff's hand. He then reached down, grabbed the two groggy miners by their necks, and hauled them to their feet with a force that rattled their teeth. He sent them scurrying, then accepted the sheriff's offer of a drink. Despite the hospitality, Leadville soured on Johnson quickly. He and Delguay despised the crowds, the noise, and the smell of civilization. They rode north into Wyoming, disgusted by the sight of cattle herds clogging the Bozeman Trail, a road they remembered as a lonely path of death. "They'll be wanting us to milk cows next," Johnson grumbled. "Nobody rode this trail when the Sioux were out but me and Portuguese Phillips." Johnson eventually drifted to Colson, Montana, a rough-and-tumble railroad town. There he accepted a job that amused the entire territory. He became a deputy sheriff. Delguay wanted no part of it. "I'm going to the Platte," he declared. "You can play nursemaid to these pilgrims if you want." Johnson proved to be a peculiar lawman. He despised paperwork and refused to arrest men for minor offenses, arguing that the county shouldn't have to pay to feed ornery pilgrims. Instead, he enforced the law with his fists. If two men wanted to fight, Johnson let them, provided they took it out of town. If they fought in the street, he knocked their heads together until they lost the will to continue. Sheriff Tom Irvin rode in from Miles City to complain that Johnson wasn't making enough official arrests, and thus not generating enough fees. "Shucks, Tom," Johnson explained. "These aren't bad men, just lively. I take the two worst ones and bump them. That settles it." Irvin gave up. Johnson kept the peace, even if he didn't fill the jail. He became a local fixture, followed by trails of awe-struck tenderfoots who gawked at his buckskins on weekdays and his ill-fitting blue broadcloth suit on Sundays. But the town life was wearing him down. Johnson felt caged. The breaking point came in the form of an old friend. Wind River Jake rode into Colson, his back bent with age, looking for the liver eater. "I'm cleaning up from the Platte," Jake announced. "I bring news from Dell." Johnson dragged the old trapper into the shade. "Here you are, Jake, looking younger than the day we pulled the wolf." Jake ignored the flattery. He had a message. "Arkansas Pete is on the Milk River, across the line in Canada. He's building a cabin, not for one man, but for two. He says to tell you to get out of here. He says you are a mountain man, not a tenderfoot." Johnson chewed on his pipe. Is Dell going? Not unless you go, Jake said. And he says you won't. I'm going back to the Platte. Johnson looked around his dusty office at the wanted posters and the stacks of paper he refused to read. He went out to the stable and stroked the nose of his big black horse. Rancher gave me that horse, Johnson told Jake. Helped him out of a poker game with a sharp. Is that all? Jake asked, looking at the trapped giant. The next day, Johnson handed in his badge. He recovered Big Anton's silver-mounted saddle, bought a supply of heavy ammunition, and sharpened his Bowie knife. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after he had tried to become civilized, liver-eating Johnson mounted his horse. He took the lead line of his pack animal and turned his back on the town. The wind was blowing from the northwest, carrying the scent of snow and freedom. He was going to the Milk River. He was going home. Last trail. I reckon he's gone up to the Milk River, the old trappers would say when asked about liver-eating Johnson's whereabouts. The upper Milk, stretching across the treeless plains of Alberta, had become the last sanctuary for the mountain man. It was a hard, cold land, scraped clean by the wind, but it was far from the settlements and the railroads. Arkansas Pete had arrived there early in the summer. He built a cabin that was a palace by trapper standards, sturdy, snug, and large enough for 2 men. Inside, 4 bunks flanked a massive fireplace. Outside, a stockade fence with a hide-hinged gate enclosed the yard, not to keep enemies out, for walls meant little in that country, but to keep his horses where he could see them. Pete built on a low bluff with a commanding view of the river. He was 70 years old, his hair gray and hanging to his waist, but he was still wire tough. He spent his days scouting trap lines and waiting for Johnson. He passed the time with a Mormon Bible given to him by his old friend Mormon Jack. Pete couldn't read a word, but he had memorized passages based on marks made by a literate friend. On his last morning, Pete sat on the bluff, Bible in hand, reciting the Psalms. The mist was rising off the river, promising a bright day. Perhaps it was his age, or the comfort of the Scripture, or the arrogance of a man who had survived 7 decades on the frontier. But Pete let his guard down. Below him, in the willow brakes, a rifle barrel slid through the brush. The shot cracked through the morning silence. Pete threw his hands up, still clutching the Bible, and toppled from his horse. The heavy bullet had torn through his ribs, heart, and lungs. A young Assiniboine warrior sprinted from cover. He found his mark dead. He took Pete's scalp, his weapons, and his horses. He looked at the Bible lying face down in the grass, but decided against taking it. He led the horses into Pete's stockade and leisurely ransacked the cabin, loading Pete's gear onto the pack animals. He even finished off the biscuits Pete had baked that morning. Satisfied, he tied Pete's gray scalp to his bridle and led his prize string north. As night fell, the wolves came for what was left of Arkansas Pete. A day later, a rider hallooed the cabin. Getting no answer, liver-eating Johnson rode through the open gate. He saw the ransacked room and knew instantly what had happened. He rode to the bluff and found the scattered bones and the skull with the missing front tooth. He found the Bible, picked it up, and tucked it into his jacket. He returned to the cabin and unloaded his pack horse, leaving the supplies in tight bundles. He ate the scraps the Assiniboine had left behind. Then, in a gesture of supreme confidence, or perhaps a challenge to the ghosts of the place, he spread his blanket on the floor facing the open door and went to sleep. Long before dawn, Johnson was awake. He gathered Pete's bones for a proper burial later. He hid his own heavy supplies, taking only the essentials. The sun was a red ball in the haze when he picked up the trail. The Assiniboine had made a fatal error. He was arrogant. He traveled slowly, confident that no one would follow him into the desolate north. Johnson pushed his horse into a gallop. He saw the signs of a leisurely pace and knew he would catch his quarry within 2 days. The first night was bitterly cold. The second day, The trail led across a frozen wasteland. On the second night, the Assiniboine camped by a frozen stream. He broke the ice to water the stolen horses, then built a roaring fire of driftwood. He was living like a king on Pete's provisions, roasting a goose he had shot, brewing Pete's coffee, and mixing dough for biscuits in Pete's pan. He was kneading the dough when a shadow fell across the fire. "Mind if I get an invite for supper?" Johnson asked. The warrior looked up, stunned. The giant mountain man stood on the other side of the fire, warming his hands casually. The Assiniboine calculated his odds. His rifle was leaning against a tree out of reach. His tomahawk was by the rocks where he had ground the coffee. His knife was in his belt, but his hands were covered in sticky dough. "You're in a bit of a fix, red nigger," Johnson drawled. He gestured toward the creek. "Step down there and wash your hands." The warrior made his choice. He snapped the dough from his fingers and went for his knife. Johnson moved through the firelight. He caught the Indian's arm, snapping the wrist with a sickening crack. He delivered a blow to the neck, then kicked the warrior hard, not to kill him, but to knock him away from the fire. "Watch the coat," Johnson growled. He wanted the beautiful wolf-skin jacket the Indian was wearing. The Assiniboine scrambled up, crouching to spring. Johnson grabbed a burning brand from the fire and smashed it across the warrior's face. As the blinded man staggered back, Johnson stepped in and shattered his jaw with a single, hammer-like punch. The neck snapped. The fight was over. Johnson scalped him. He stripped the prized jacket from the body, along with Pete's hooped scalp. Then he sat down and ate the Indian's dinner, the goose, the biscuits, and the coffee. He realized later he had left his rifle on his saddle, but it hadn't mattered. As he ate, the wind picked up. A blizzard was rolling in. Johnson rounded up the 6 horses, hobbled them in the shelter of the creek bank, and dragged heavy logs to the fire. He was going to ride out the storm in comfort. But before he wrapped himself in his buffalo robe, he had one last ritual to perform. He carved a piece of flesh from the dead warrior and hung it in a tree to freeze in the wind. He slept soundly. By morning, the snow was deep, but the storm had passed. Johnson packed up, retrieved the frozen trophy from the tree, and began the long trek back to the Milk River. 5 days later, he crested the hill. Above Pete's cabin, he peered through the willows, rifle ready. Smoke was curling from the chimney. A strange horse was in the corral. Johnson cocked his rifle. 3 distinct clicks in the silent air. A man stepped out of the cabin, then jumped back at the sound. Johnson lowered the gun. He was ashamed he hadn't recognized the figure sooner. It was Del Guay. Johnson rode down, driving the recovered horses into the stockade. His mission was complete. He was home. The 2 old partners spent the winter trapping Pete's line. They buried Pete's bones on the bluff, then dug them up in the spring to move them to the Yellowstone, deciding Pete would prefer the company there. It was a quiet winter. They saw no Indians. However, a French-Canadian trapper passing through mentioned that a band of Assiniboines had found the body of their kinsman. They knew who had killed him by the specific mutilation of the corpse. Del Guay asked no questions. He waited until spring after they had sold their furs and reburied Pete. One evening, sitting by the Yellowstone, Del twisted his whiskers and looked at his friend. "You ate that Assiniboine's liver, didn't you?" "So I finally got around to that," Johnson admitted. "I saw it was bothering you, but I thought you'd never ask." "Where is the liver?" Del asked, morbidly curious. "You can't keep livers in hot weather," Johnson said. "You remember that fine otter skin I held out when we sold the pack? The one hanging in the cabin?" "That's your Indian liver," the crow killer said. Del stared at him in amazement. "First time I ever heard of baiting a trap with an Indian liver," he said, shaking his head. "Almost like having Pete back." Lodge by the sea. Throughout the late 1880s, liver-eating Johnson and Del Guay continued to work the trap lines along the Yellowstone and Musselshell rivers. Despite their age, they remained profitable, 2 holdouts from a vanished era surviving in the cracks of a modernizing world. But the Restlessness that drives all frontiersmen eventually drove a wedge between them. Delguay wanted to push north into Canada, seeking wilder country. Johnson, however, was done with roving. He refused lucrative offers to join Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. He had lived the reality and had no interest in pantomiming it for Eastern audiences. He resolved to stay in the territory he had helped carve out. The parting of the two partners was typical of their breed. No sentimentality, just a nod and a warning to watch your top knot. Johnson stood by their cabin on the Yellowstone and watched his oldest friend ride away for the last time. In 1888, Johnson moved to Bear Creek. He built a cabin intending to trap a little and hunt a little, but civilization caught up with him. The nearby coal town of Red Lodge needed a marshal, and they unanimously elected the most feared man in the territory. Johnson's tenure as the first marshal of Red Lodge was quiet. His reputation did most of the work. Outlaws gave the town a wide berth. He handled the occasional drunk with a firm hand, leaving him plenty of time to retreat to the Big Snow Mountains for solitude. To the new settlers, he was a living relic. To the children of Red Lodge, however, the terrifying Crow Killer was a guardian angel. Ralph Lumley, who grew up in the town, remembered Johnson not as a cannibal, but as a protector. Lumley recalled a winter evening when a road show came to town. The local boys, penniless, stacked empty beer barrels against the back of the show hall to peek through a high window. Suddenly, a booming voice commanded, "Get down off them barrels." Johnson grabbed the boys by the seats of their pants, but instead of dragging them to jail, the giant marshal threw open his massive winter overcoat. He tucked the boys under his arms like contraband, marched past the ticket taker, and deposited them in the front row. He stood at the back, watching the show and the children with a satisfaction he rarely showed adults. Red Lodge was a symbol of the New West, a town built on coal, barbed wire, and railroads. Johnson lived among his friends there, a ghost in his own lifetime. In the wider world, rumors swirled that liver-eating Johnson had died years ago, killed by crows in the 70s or frozen in a blizzard. Old trappers would argue over sightings, claiming to have seen him on the Chugwater or the Musselshell, but to the general public he was already a myth. But the iron constitution that had survived arrows, blizzards, and strychnine finally faltered. Around 1895, Johnson's health collapsed. He was destitute. His land was gone, and his body was failing. The townspeople of Red Lodge rallied around him, offering charity, but the old mountain man's pride made it agony to accept. He had always been the provider, the predator, the survivor. To be helpless was a fate worse than death. Finally, his friends suggested a solution that offered dignity, the old soldier's home. Eighteenth was a cruel irony. Decades earlier, old John Hatcher, Johnson's first mentor, had dreamed of going to California to lay his bones beside the sea. Now, 50 years later, Johnson followed that same path. He was admitted to the Veterans Hospital in Los Angeles in December 1899. The man who had slept in snowbanks and fought grizzly bears with a frozen leg now lay in a hospital bed, surrounded by palm trees and the soft Pacific air. He lasted 1 month. On January 21st, 1900, John Johnston, liver-eating Johnson, Dapiek Absaroka, White Chief of the Shoshone, died quietly. He was not buried in a cairn of stones on a windswept bluff, nor in a lonely canyon guarded by skulls. He was laid to rest in a crowded cemetery in Los Angeles. To find him, one must drive down Wilshire Boulevard, past the manicured lawns of Beverly Hills and the traffic of the modern world. He lies in the San Juan Hill section, Row D. There are no buffalo skulls or medicine poles to mark the spot. The second stone from the road bears a simple inscription for a man who contained multitudes, John Johnston. He rests far from the shining mountains, in a lodge by the sea. The wind that blows over his grave smells of salt, not sagebrush. But the legend remains in the high country, whispering through the aspens on the Little Snake and echoing off the canyon walls of the Musselshell. The story of the man who became a monster to avenge a love and became a man again before the end.